Tonight, we begin a journey that will carry you deep into rest and plant seeds of profound peace in your mind. These are not lessons or techniques to memorize. They are ancient Buddhist teachings that gently guide you back to the peace that has always lived within you. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. As we journey together through this timeless wisdom, you may find your breathing naturally deepening, your body naturally relaxing. This is not something you need to force. It is the natural response of a mind that finally understands its true nature. The wisdom of Zen teaches us that peace is not something we must create. It is something already here that we must uncover. Like a clear mountain lake that becomes muddy when stirred, our minds become clouded when we struggle and grasp. Settle in now. Relax. Take a slow, deep breath. And let's begin our gentle journey into rest. One of the deepest teachings in Zen Buddhism is about acceptance. Not the kind of acceptance where we pretend to like things we don't like, or where we become passive and stop caring. True acceptance is something much more profound. It is the practice of meeting reality exactly as it is, without adding the extra layer of suffering that comes from wishing things were different. When something difficult happens in our lives, we often respond in two ways. First, there is the actual difficulty itself. Then there is our resistance to that difficulty, our mental argument with reality about how things should not be this way. Zen teaches us that while we may not be able to control the first part, we have complete freedom over the second. And it is often the second part, our resistance, that causes us the most pain. Think of it this way. If you are walking barefoot and you step on a small stone, there is a moment of discomfort. That is the first part, the actual pain. But then the mind often adds a second layer. Why was that stone there? Who should have cleared this path? Why does this always happen to me? This mental commentary doesn't make the foot feel any better. It only adds frustration and tension to what was already uncomfortable. Acceptance in Zen means learning to work with what is actually here, rather than exhausting ourselves by fighting what has already happened. When we stop arguing with reality, something interesting occurs. We discover a natural peace that was hidden beneath all that struggling. We find we have energy available to respond wisely, energy that was previously consumed by resistance. This teaching about acceptance extends into every corner of our lives. It changes how we meet loss, how we respond to change, how we handle the gap between our expectations and our actual experience. When we learn to accept what is, we don't become passive. We become free. Free to act from wisdom rather than from the panic of not wanting things to be as they are. Let us explore this wisdom through a story about a master who faced a devastating loss and whose response revealed the true meaning of acceptance. In a remote mountain monastery, there lived a master named Kosen who was renowned throughout the region for his vast collection of ancient texts. For over 40 years, he had carefully gathered the rarest Buddhist scriptures, philosophical treatises, and poetry from across the land. Scholars would travel for weeks just to study in his library, which contained treasures that existed nowhere else in the world. The library itself was a work of art. Wooden shelves carved by master craftsmen reached from floor to ceiling. Each scroll was wrapped in silk and stored with meticulous care. The room smelled of cedar and aged paper, and morning light filtered through paper windows, casting a golden glow over centuries of accumulated wisdom. Kosen would spend his early hours each day in this sacred space, reading by candlelight before the other monks awakened. He had a special ritual each morning. He would enter the library before dawn, light a single candle, and sit for a moment in the silence. Then he would select one text, often at random, and read slowly, savoring each character. Sometimes he would spend an entire hour on a single page, contemplating the depth of what the ancient masters had written. Other monks would see the light under his door and know their teacher was in his sacred place. The collection had grown slowly over the decades. When Kosen first came to the monastery as a young monk, the library held only a few dozen texts. But he had made it his life's work to seek out and preserve the teachings. He would travel to distant temples, carefully negotiate with other abbots, and sometimes copy texts by hand when the owners would not part with the originals. Each addition to the collection felt like welcoming a new member into the family. One autumn night, while the community slept, a terrible fire swept through the monastery. It started in the kitchen, where coals from the evening fire had not been fully extinguished. The flames, fed by strong mountain winds, moved with frightening speed through the wooden structures. The monastery bell rang out in alarm. Monks stumbled from their sleeping quarters into the cold night air, coughing from the smoke. They formed a line to the well, passing buckets of water, but the fire had already taken hold. The flames leapt from building to building, indifferent to the efforts of the bucket brigade. Kosen emerged from his quarters and immediately understood the situation. "Everyone to the courtyard," he called out calmly. "Make sure all our brothers are accounted for. Let the buildings go." The monks managed to escape safely, but there was no time to save anything else. They stood in the courtyard, faces lit by the orange glow, watching helplessly as their home was consumed. Some of the younger monks wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. The library burned with particular intensity. The dry paper of the ancient texts fed the flames, and the wooden shelves became fuel. All those ancient manuscripts, irreplaceable scrolls, and precious books turned to ash in minutes. 40 years of careful collecting vanished in a single night. One monk tried to run back toward the library, but 2 others held him back. There was nothing that could be done. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, the monks gathered around their teacher, expecting to find him devastated by this immense loss. They had all seen how much he loved his collection, how carefully he tended each text, how his face would light up when he discovered a rare manuscript. Instead, they found Kosen sitting calmly on a large stone near the temple gate, his robes covered in soot, watching smoke rise from where his beloved library had stood. His face showed no trace of anger, grief, or regret. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, breathing slowly, as peaceful as if he were in meditation. One young monk, unable to contain his confusion, approached with tears in his eyes. His name was Jiro, and he had only been at the monastery for 2 years. He had loved studying in the library, running his fingers along the spines of ancient texts, feeling connected to centuries of wisdom. "Master," Jiro said, his voice breaking, "how can you be so peaceful? All those precious teachings, all those years of work, everything is gone. Doesn't this loss break your heart?" Kosen looked at his student with eyes full of gentle compassion. He patted the stone beside him, inviting Jiro to sit. The young monk sat down, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "My dear friend," Kosen said softly, "those books contained wonderful words about truth. But they were not truth itself. The real Dharma was never written on paper or stored on shelves. It lives here, he touched his chest, and here he gestured to Jiro's heart. Fire cannot burn what is truly precious. Jiro looked at his teacher with confusion. But master, you spent 40 years collecting those texts. I've seen you work late into the night, copying manuscripts by hand. How can you say they don't matter? I did not say they don't matter, Kosen replied. I said they are not truth itself. There is a difference. A menu describes food, but you cannot eat the menu. A map shows the way, but you cannot walk on the map. The texts pointed toward wisdom, but they were not wisdom itself. The young monk persisted. But master, think of all the wisdom that is lost forever. Future generations will never be able to read those texts. Students who come here seeking knowledge will find nothing. Kosen smiled peacefully and looked out at the ruins. The fire has given us a great teaching. It has shown us the difference between the finger pointing at the moon and the moon itself. We spent so much time polishing and protecting the finger that we sometimes forgot to look at what it was pointing toward. Another monk, an older brother named Takeo, who had studied with Kosen for many years, joined them on the stone. Master, forgive me, but I must speak honestly. I feel angry about this loss. All your work destroyed in one night. It doesn't seem fair. Kosen nodded with understanding. Your anger is natural, Takeo. Feel it completely. But also notice something. The anger does not change what happened. The fire has already burned. The texts are already gone. Your anger is your argument with what has already occurred. He stood slowly and placed a gentle hand on each monk's shoulder. Yesterday I was the keeper of books. Today I am simply a teacher. Yesterday I worried about preserving old wisdom. Today I am free to embody it directly. The fire has not taken anything away. It has revealed what was always here. Over the following days, as the community began the work of rebuilding, something remarkable happened. Without the distraction of managing and protecting his vast collection, Kosen's teaching became more direct and powerful than ever before. Students who had traveled expecting to study ancient texts instead encountered a living embodiment of the wisdom those texts had tried to capture. In the morning, where Kosen used to be found reading in his library, he now sat with students in the ruins, teaching directly from his experience. His words had a freshness they had never had before. When students asked questions, he no longer said, "Let me show you what the sutras say about this." Instead, he spoke from the depth of his own understanding. The master had discovered that his attachment to preserving the Dharma had, in subtle ways, prevented him from fully expressing it. The fire had freed him from being a curator of truth and allowed him to become truth itself. This story illuminates something profound about the nature of acceptance in Zen practice. True acceptance is not about liking what happens to us. Kosen did not celebrate the fire or pretend he was happy about losing his library. Instead, he accepted the reality of what had occurred and opened himself to whatever wisdom it might contain. In Zen, we learn that resistance to what has already happened is the source of our deepest suffering. We waste precious energy fighting battles that were already won or lost. When we stop this futile struggle against reality, we discover an inner freedom that no external circumstance can touch. The fire in this story represents all the unexpected losses and changes that life brings us. Sometimes it burns away our cherished plans, our familiar identities, or our treasured possessions. Our first instinct is to see these events as tragedies, as enemies of our happiness. But Zen teaches us to look deeper. What if every loss is also a liberation? What if what burns away was only binding us? Kosen discovered that his attachment to preserving wisdom had become an obstacle to embodying it. The fire freed him from being a keeper of truth and allowed him to become truth itself. This teaching extends to every area of our lives. When we lose a job we thought defined us, we might discover talents we never knew we had. When a relationship ends, we might find a capacity for solitude and self-reliance that strengthens us. When illness limits our physical abilities, we might develop inner resources that are far more valuable. There is something else worth noticing in this story. The young monk expected his teacher to be devastated. He came with tears in his eyes, ready to console someone who should have been broken by loss. But Kosen was sitting peacefully, simply watching the smoke rise. This teaches us something important about our assumptions. We often assume that certain events must lead to certain feelings. Loss must lead to grief. Change must lead to anxiety. Disappointment must lead to bitterness. But Zen shows us that these connections are not as fixed as we think. What causes our suffering is not the events themselves, but our relationship to those events. Kosen had spent 40 years building his collection. 40 years of careful searching, preserving, protecting. Anyone would understand if he felt crushed by seeing it all destroyed. But he had practiced acceptance so deeply that he could see beyond the surface of loss to the teaching it contained. He could recognize that what he truly valued, the wisdom itself, had never been in danger. This is the freedom that acceptance practice offers. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom in the midst of difficulty. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of peace even when loss occurs. When we stop demanding that life should be other than it is, we discover a stability that doesn't depend on circumstances staying pleasant. The practice of acceptance begins with a simple recognition. What has already happened has already happened. Our resistance cannot change the past, but our acceptance can transform our future. When we stop fighting what is, we become available to what might be. Take another gentle breath now. Feel how your body naturally relaxes when you stop bracing against imaginary threats. This is the physical sensation of acceptance. Not collapse, but a wise yielding that conserves your energy for what truly matters. There is another dimension of acceptance that Zen teaches us to explore. Sometimes we resist not just external events, but aspects of ourselves and our experience that we judge as imperfect or inadequate. Let us turn now to a story that reveals how acceptance can transform even our relationship with imperfection itself. There was once a young student named Daiki who came to study at a mountain monastery known for its exquisite gardens. He had always been drawn to beauty and perfection, and he hoped that learning to tend these famous gardens would bring him closer to enlightenment. He imagined spending his days among perfectly arranged flowers, geometrically precise pathways, and trees pruned into ideal forms. Daiki had grown up in a merchant family in the city. His father sold fine ceramics, and from a young age, Daiki had been trained to recognize quality and spot imperfections. A crack in a bowl, a slight unevenness in glaze, these were things to be avoided, corrected, or discarded. He brought this same eye for perfection to his spiritual practice. On his first morning at the monastery, the head gardener, an elderly monk named Soshin, led Daiki on a tour of the grounds. They walked through sections of remarkable beauty where everything seemed to grow in perfect harmony. Cherry trees formed elegant arches over stone pathways. Moss-covered rocks in patterns that looked almost intentional. Streams flowed with gentle musical sounds over carefully placed stones. Soshin moved slowly, stopping frequently to observe small details. He would crouch down to examine a particular flower or pause to listen to the sound of water flowing over stones. His weathered hands would occasionally reach out to adjust a branch or remove a fallen leaf. Daiki tried to memorize everything, taking mental notes about which plants grew where, how the paths were designed, and how the elements worked together. "This is the formal garden," Soshin explained. "We have maintained it for 300 years. Each generation of gardeners adds their care to what came before." Daiki felt inspired. This was exactly the kind of perfection he had hoped to learn about. Every element was precisely placed. Every plant was healthy and well tended. It was like a living work of art. But as they continued their walk, they came to a section that seemed forgotten or neglected. Here, plants grew wild and seemingly random. Weeds pushed up between stones. Branches grew in odd directions, reaching out into pathways. The ground was uneven, and fallen leaves had accumulated in corners. At the center of this unkempt area stood an ancient pine tree that had been twisted and bent by decades of mountain storms. The tree was unlike anything Daiki had ever seen. Its trunk curved in 3 directions at once, as if the tree could not decide which way to grow. Its branches reached out at strange angles, some pointing down instead of up. The bark was scarred and weathered, with deep grooves that collected rainwater. Several branches appeared to be dead, their wood bleached grey by sun and wind. Daiki stopped walking and stared at the tree with obvious distaste. It seemed so out of place, so wrong compared to the carefully tended gardens they had just walked through. He wondered why such an eyesore had been allowed to remain. "Master Soshin," he said, trying to be respectful but unable to hide his disapproval, "surely this old tree mars the beauty of your garden. Why don't you remove it and plant something more pleasing? Something that grows straight and strong like the other pines?" Soshin stopped walking and turned to face his student. Then he gazed at the twisted tree with obvious affection, the way one might look at an old friend. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "This tree," he said softly, "is my greatest teacher. It has shown me something that all the perfect specimens could never reveal." Daiki looked confused. He glanced at the formal gardens behind them, then back at this gnarled, misshapen tree. What could this damaged tree possibly teach that a healthy one cannot? The old gardener walked closer to the twisted pine and placed his weathered hand gently on its rough bark. He stood there for a moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. "This tree has been here for over 200 years, Soshin began. "Long before this monastery was built. Long before the formal gardens were designed. It was here when this mountain was wild and untended." He traced his finger along one of the deep grooves in the bark. "This tree has survived storms that destroyed younger, straighter trees. See how it bends? That is not weakness. That is wisdom. It has learned to yield to the wind rather than resist it. It has bent without breaking, adapted without losing its essential nature." Soshin walked around the tree slowly, gesturing to different features. Every curve in its trunk tells a story of resilience. This curve here? That was the year of the Great Typhoon, when winds tore across this mountain for 3 days. A straight tree would have snapped. This one bent and survived. He pointed to another section. And this branch that grows downward instead of up? That was its response to a landslide that covered part of its roots. It found another way to gather sunlight. Every twisted branch speaks of creative response to difficulty. The old gardener looked at his young student with eyes full of warmth. The straight trees in the formal garden are beautiful, yes, but their beauty is dependent on perfect conditions. They must be protected from strong winds, given ideal soil, pruned regularly to maintain their shape. We create those conditions for them, and in return they give us the beauty we desire. He turned back to the twisted pine. But this old tree has found its own way to be beautiful despite imperfect conditions. Perhaps because of them. It has never had our help, our protection, our careful tending. Yet here it stands, alive and strong after 2 centuries. Soshin led Daiki to a stone bench that had been placed facing the tree. The bench itself was weathered and covered with lichen, as if it too had been there for many years. He invited his student to sit. For the next week, Soshin said, I want you to spend 1 hour each morning simply sitting with this tree. Don't try to fix it or improve it. Don't judge it or wish it were different. Simply be present with it as it is. Observe it. Notice what you notice. Daiki felt disappointed. He had come to learn about creating beauty, about the principles of garden design, about how to achieve perfection. Sitting and staring at an ugly tree seemed like a waste of time. But he trusted his teacher and agreed to the practice. The first morning was difficult. Daiki sat reluctantly on the stone bench, arms crossed, his mind filled with criticism. The tree looked broken to him, a symbol of everything that goes wrong when things are not properly maintained. He spent most of the hour planning how the garden could be improved once this unsightly specimen was removed. Perhaps a stone lantern could be placed here instead, or a carefully pruned azalea bush. The second morning was much the same. He sat, he looked, he judged. The tree remained ugly in his eyes. He began to feel frustrated with the exercise. What was the point? Any fool could see this tree was damaged and unattractive. But on the third morning, something small began to shift. As the sun rose, its early light caught the deep grooves in the bark at a particular angle, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that were unexpectedly beautiful. The rough texture looked almost like a landscape, with valleys and ridges catching the gold of morning. Daiki found himself leaning forward slightly, interested despite himself. He had never really looked at bark before, never paid attention to its texture and pattern. The straight trees in the formal garden had smooth, uniform bark. But this bark told a story in its irregularity. On the 4th day, a light rain fell during his sitting time. Daiki watched as water collected in the grooves of the bark, forming tiny streams that trickled down the trunk. A small bird landed on one of the twisted branches and drank from a natural bowl that had formed where a branch met the trunk. The bird sang briefly, then flew away. Daiki realized that the tree's unusual shape had created a perfect drinking spot for birds. A straight tree would not have this feature. On the 5th morning, he noticed a spider's web strung between 2 of the downward growing branches. The web was covered in dew, and each droplet caught the morning light, making the web look like a necklace of tiny jewels. The unusual angles of the branches provided perfect anchor points for the web. Again, a straight tree could not offer this. By the end of the week, Daiki found himself looking forward to his morning time with the tree. He began arriving a few minutes early, eager to see what he might notice that day. The tree had become familiar to him, almost like an old friend. He knew which branches would catch the morning light first, where the birds preferred to land, how the shadows moved as the sun rose. On the final morning, as Daiki sat in his usual spot, Soshin joined him on the bench. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the tree in the early light. "What has the tree taught you?" the old master finally asked. Daiki was quiet for a long moment before responding. He wanted to find the right words. "It has taught me that there are different kinds of beauty. The formal gardens are beautiful like a perfect poem, each word chosen and placed with care. But this tree is beautiful like a wise face that shows its history. Every line, every scar tells a story." He paused, thinking. "I came here wanting to learn how to make things perfect, to eliminate all flaws and create ideal beauty. But the tree has shown me how to find perfection in things as they are. It has shown me that what I called flaws are actually strengths. That what I called damage is actually adaptation." Soshin nodded slowly, a slight smile on his weathered face. "The tree grows according to its nature and circumstances. It doesn't try to be a different tree. It doesn't compare itself to the straight pines and feel inferior. It simply responds to each moment with authenticity." The old gardener stood and stretched. "This is the deepest teaching of Zen. Not to force ourselves or our world into predetermined shapes, but to find the natural perfection that emerges when we stop fighting what is. The tree never fought against the storms. It bent with them. It never resisted the difficult soil. It found a way to grow anyway." As they walked back toward the monastery together, Daiki turned one last time to look at the twisted pine. It no longer looked ugly to him. It looked honest, real, true to itself in a way that the carefully pruned trees could never be. This story reveals another layer of acceptance that is crucial to Zen understanding. We often think acceptance means tolerating what we don't like. But true acceptance goes deeper. It means discovering that what we initially resist may contain exactly the wisdom or beauty we need. Daiki's journey from criticism to appreciation mirrors our own process. Like the twisted pine, we all carry marks from the difficulties we have faced. We all have aspects of ourselves that don't match some ideal image. Zen teaches us that these are not obstacles to peace. They are the very material from which wisdom emerges. Notice how Soshin taught his student. He did not lecture about the value of imperfection. He simply invited Daiki to sit with the tree, to be present without judgment. This is how Zen teaching works. Not through concepts, but through direct experience. When Daiki stopped judging and simply looked, his perception naturally shifted. This teaching transforms how we relate to everything in our lives that seems less than ideal. The difficult relationship that teaches us patience, the limitation that shows us creativity, the failure that redirects our path. When we stop demanding that life conform to our preferences, we become available to receive its actual gifts. Both Kosen and Daiki discovered something essential. Kosen learned that his attachment to preserving wisdom had become an obstacle to embodying it. Daiki learned that his rejection of imperfection had prevented him from seeing a deeper kind of beauty. Both found freedom not by changing their circumstances, but by changing their relationship to those circumstances. The practice of acceptance begins simply. When you encounter something you want to be different, pause. Meet it with curiosity rather than judgment. Ask what it might be teaching you. This doesn't mean abandoning all effort to grow or improve. It means working with what is here rather than exhausting yourself fighting against it. As you rest now, feel how acceptance creates a natural ease in your body. Notice how you can breathe more deeply when you're not bracing against reality. This is the peace that Zen Buddhism offers. Not a peace that depends on perfect circumstances, but a peace that remains steady by meeting each moment exactly as it arrives. Tomorrow's challenges will still be there, but you need not meet them with resistance. You can meet them with the flexible strength of the ancient pine, bending without breaking, finding your own authentic way to thrive. Sleep comes naturally to a mind that has learned to accept what is. In Zen Buddhism, compassion is understood as something far deeper than simply feeling sorry for others or being nice when it is convenient. True compassion begins with a radical understanding. It sees that beneath every harmful action lies some form of suffering. Beneath every difficult behavior lies pain that has not been met with kindness. When someone acts in ways that hurt others, our first response is often anger or judgment. We see the harmful action and we want to push it away, to punish it, to make it stop. This is natural. But Zen teaching invites us to look deeper. What pain drives this behavior? What suffering has gone unmet? When we can see the hurt beneath the harm, we open the door to genuine transformation. Compassion in this tradition is not weakness. It is not naive acceptance of harmful behavior. It is the wisdom to respond to the root cause, rather than just reacting to the symptoms. When we meet suffering with understanding instead of punishment, we create conditions where healing becomes possible. But there is another teaching about compassion that is equally important, perhaps even more so. Before we can truly offer compassion to others, we must learn to offer it to ourselves. Many of us carry an inner voice that is harsh and critical, far harsher than we would ever be with a friend. We judge our mistakes mercilessly. We attack ourselves for being imperfect. We demand of ourselves what we would never demand of another person. This internal harshness is a form of violence we commit against ourselves every day. And Zen teaches that we cannot offer what we do not have. If we show only cruelty to ourselves, how can we show true kindness to others? The compassion we cultivate within becomes the foundation for all the compassion we offer outward. Let us explore this wisdom through a story about a man who discovered that compassion has the power to transform even the most difficult situations. In a small village at the edge of a vast forest lived a baker named Kenji, who was known for his kind heart and generous spirit. Every morning before dawn, he would light his ovens and begin preparing fresh bread for the day. The warm smell of baking would drift through the village streets, waking people gently and filling their hearts with anticipation. Kenji had a simple practice that he had maintained for many years. He would always bake a few extra loaves each day and leave them on a wooden shelf outside his shop with a small sign that read, "For those who need them." Travelers, poor families, and anyone who was hungry could take what they needed without having to ask or explain their circumstances. Kenji never kept track of how many loaves were taken. He simply baked extra each day and trusted that the bread would find its way to those who needed it most. The village had always been peaceful, and Kenji's practice had never caused any trouble. People took only what they needed, and often those who took bread 1 month would return the next to leave a small coin or a bundle of vegetables in gratitude. But one harsh winter, when snow fell for weeks without stopping and food became scarce, everything changed. A group of desperate men who had been living rough in the forest began coming into the village at night, taking whatever they could find. They would break into shops and homes, stealing food, tools, and anything of value they could carry. The village lived in fear. Families barred their doors at night. Shopkeepers began sleeping in their stores to protect their goods. Everyone was angry and frightened. Kenji's shop was robbed 3 times in 2 weeks. The first time, the thieves took not just the free bread from the shelf outside, but also coins from his cash box and several bags of flour from his storeroom. The second time, they took more flour and broke his mixing bowls searching for hidden money. The third time, they overturned his carefully organized workspace, leaving flour spilled across the floor and tools scattered everywhere. Each time, Kenji would arrive in the morning to find the damage. He would quietly clean up, repair what he could, and begin baking again. He did not complain to his neighbors or report the thefts to the village elder. He simply continued his work. The other villagers were outraged on Kenji's behalf. They came to his shop with advice and anger. "You must stop leaving bread outside," they told him. "You're just encouraging them. Put bars on your windows. Get a large dog to guard your shop at night. Show these criminals that you won't be an easy target." But Kenji continued his practice. Each morning he would clean up any damage from the night before, bake his bread as usual, and still leave extra loaves on the shelf outside. The loaves disappeared even more quickly now, often within minutes of being placed there. His neighbors thought he was foolish. "They're stealing from you," they said. "They're taking advantage of your kindness. Why do you keep feeding them?" Kenji would only smile gently and say, "Someone is hungry. That is all I know for certain." One particularly cold night, Kenji was working late in his shop, preparing dough for the next day's baking. The work was soothing to him. His hands knew the rhythm of kneading without thinking. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The repetitive motion calmed his mind. He heard a sound at his front door. A scraping, scratching sound of someone trying to work the latch. Kenji's heart beat faster, but he did not feel afraid. He felt something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or sadness for whoever was so desperate they would risk breaking into a shop while the owner was still inside. He walked to the door and opened it himself. 3 men stood there in the darkness, their faces gaunt with hunger and their clothes torn from living rough in the winter forest. They had clearly come to steal again, but they froze when they saw Kenji looking at them directly. They had expected to find the shop empty. They had not expected to face the man they had been robbing. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. The 3 men stared at Kenji, and Kenji looked back at them with calm eyes. "You must be very hungry," Kenji said softly, "to be out on such a cold night." The men didn't know how to respond. They had expected anger, perhaps violence. They had certainly not expected kindness. The youngest of the 3 looked ready to run. The oldest, who seemed to be their leader, stood very still, his eyes wary and confused. I have fresh soup cooking on the stove, Kenji continued, his voice gentle. And there's warm bread just out of the oven. Would you like to come in and eat? The oldest man looked suspicious. Why would you help us? Don't you know who we are? We're the ones who've been taking from you. Kenji nodded calmly. I know. And I can see that you take only what you need to survive. A man doesn't steal bread because he's evil. He steals bread because he's hungry. He stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. The winter is hard for everyone, but it doesn't have to make us into enemies. Slowly, cautiously, the three men entered the warm bakery. The heat from the ovens wrapped around them like a blanket. The smell of fresh bread made their stomachs clench with hunger. They stood awkwardly near the door, not sure what to do or whether to trust this unexpected kindness. Kenji served them bowl after bowl of hot soup and all the fresh bread they could eat. He didn't ask questions or make them explain themselves. He simply gave them food and let them eat in peace. As they warmed up and filled their empty stomachs, tension gradually left their bodies. Their hands stopped shaking. Their faces began to show something other than fear and desperation. When they had eaten their fill, they began to talk. Not because Kenji asked, but because his quiet presence made them feel safe enough to speak. They told him their stories. They had all worked at the iron mine in the next valley. When the mine closed suddenly, they lost their jobs. With no work available and their savings gone, they had been forced to leave their homes and live in the forest. We tried begging at first, the youngest one said, his eyes downcast with shame. But the villagers chased us away. They said we were lazy, that we should find work. But there is no work. We looked everywhere. We never wanted to hurt anyone, the middle one added. We just didn't want to starve. Kenji listened to all of this with deep attention. When they finished speaking, he sat quietly for a moment, thinking. Then he made an offer that astonished them. I could use help with the early morning baking, he said. The work is hard and the hours are long. You would need to be here before dawn each day. But there's always enough food, and there's a room above the shop where you could sleep. If you're willing to work, you're welcome to stay. The three men looked at each other in disbelief. They had come to steal from this man, and he was offering them jobs and shelter. The oldest man shook his head slowly, tears forming in his eyes. Why would you trust us? We've robbed you 3 times. Kenji smiled gently. Because I believe that people do better when they're given the chance to do better. You stole because you were desperate. But desperation isn't who you are. It's just a situation you were in. And now you have the chance to be in a different situation. The men stayed. They worked harder than any employees Kenji had ever had, grateful beyond words for the chance to earn an honest living again. They were up before dawn each day, their hands white with flour, their faces showing the satisfaction that comes from honest work. Within a few months, the bakery was more prosperous than it had ever been. The village became peaceful again. The 3 men who had been feared as dangerous thieves became known as reliable workers and good neighbors. Years later, when people would ask Kenji why he had chosen kindness over punishment, he would say, "Fear creates more fear. Anger creates more anger." But compassion has the power to transform even the most difficult situations. When we respond to suffering with understanding instead of judgment, we give everyone involved the chance to become better than they were before. This story shows us something essential about compassion in Buddhist teaching. Kenji understood what many of us forget. The thieves were not evil people who enjoyed causing harm. They were human beings caught in desperate circumstances, acting out of pain and need rather than malice. When he responded to their actions with compassion instead of anger, he created the conditions for genuine transformation. The other villagers saw only the harmful actions. They wanted protection, punishment, barriers. These responses are natural and sometimes necessary. But Kenji saw deeper. He saw the suffering that drove the behavior, and he had the courage to respond to that suffering rather than just reacting to its symptoms. This is what Buddhist compassion looks like in action. Not ignoring harmful behavior or pretending everything is fine, but meeting the root cause with understanding and offering a genuine path toward healing. The three men did not stop stealing because they were punished. They stopped because someone saw their humanity and offered them a way back to their own dignity. Notice also that Kenji's compassion was practical, not just emotional. He didn't simply feel sorry for the men. He offered them real work, real shelter, a real opportunity to change their situation. Compassion in Zen is not passive sympathy. It is active engagement with suffering, working to create conditions where transformation becomes possible. When we learn to see this way, to look beneath harmful actions to the suffering that drives them, we become agents of healing rather than agents of more pain. This doesn't mean accepting all behavior or putting ourselves in danger. It means understanding that lasting solutions come from addressing root causes rather than just reacting to symptoms. Now, let us turn to another essential aspect of compassion, one that many people overlook: the compassion we show to ourselves. For we cannot truly offer to others what we have not learned to offer to ourselves. There was once a student named Miki who came to study at a mountain temple known for its rigorous meditation practice. She had heard stories about monks there who could sit in perfect stillness for hours, their minds clear and calm, their practice strong and unwavering. She wanted desperately to achieve this same level of mastery. Miki had always been someone who demanded a lot from herself. As a child, she had been praised for her discipline and criticized for her mistakes. She learned early that love and approval came through achievement and perfection. She brought this same approach to her spiritual practice, believing that if she just tried hard enough, she could force herself to become enlightened. She threw herself into the practice with fierce determination. Each morning she would rise at 3, a full hour before the other students, to get extra meditation time. She would sit through meals in silence, barely eating, her mind focused on spiritual matters instead of the simple act of nourishing her body. She pushed herself to meditate for longer periods than anyone else, often sitting until her legs went completely numb and her back ached terribly. But instead of the peace and clarity she sought, Miki found her mind becoming more agitated and critical than ever before. During meditation, she would attack each wandering thought with harsh inner commentary. Focus, she would command herself. Stop being so undisciplined. Other students can do this easily. What's wrong with you? When her meditation felt scattered, she would punish herself by skipping meals or adding extra hours of sitting, even when her body was exhausted. When she felt drowsy during practice, she would scold herself for being lazy and weak. Her entire inner dialogue became a constant stream of judgment and disappointment. After months of this harsh self-treatment, Miki was more miserable than when she had arrived. Her body was thin and tired from skipping meals and pushing too hard. Her mind was exhausted from constant criticism. Her heart felt heavy with shame about what she saw as her failures. She felt like she was the worst student at the temple, incapable of even the most basic spiritual practice. One morning, after a particularly difficult meditation session where she had berated herself for every wandering thought, Mickey went to the temple's small garden to cry in private. She sat beneath a cherry tree on a stone bench, tears running down her face, feeling like a complete failure. Master Yuki, the temple's elderly teacher, happened to be walking through the garden. She was a small woman with white hair and deep laugh lines around her eyes. When she saw Mickey's distress, she sat down quietly beside her on the bench. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, present and calm. After a few minutes, Master Yuki spoke softly. "Tell me about your practice." Through her tears, Mickey poured out her frustration. She described her rigorous schedule, her constant self-criticism, her disappointment in her lack of progress. "I try so hard," she sobbed, "but I'm just not good enough. I'll never be able to meditate like the other students. My mind is too scattered. My discipline is too weak. Maybe I should just give up and go home." Master Yuki listened in compassionate silence, her face showing only understanding and care. When Miki finished, the old teacher pointed to a small bird that had landed near their feet. The bird was pecking at the ground, searching for seeds and insects, moving in quick, efficient movements. "Watch this little bird," Master Yuki said. "See how naturally it moves? It doesn't criticize itself for not finding food quickly enough. It doesn't compare itself to other birds. It doesn't judge its own performance. It simply does what birds do, moment by moment, with complete acceptance of its own nature." Mickey watched the bird for several minutes. There was something peaceful about its movements, something utterly without self-consciousness or judgment. It searched for food, found some, ate it, and searched again. Simple, natural, complete. "Now," Master Yuki continued, "imagine if this bird spent its time telling itself it was a terrible bird, that it should fly better or sing more beautifully, that other birds were superior and it was failing at being a bird. What would happen to its natural ability to find food and shelter? What would happen to its simple joy in being alive?" Mickey understood immediately. It would be too busy criticizing itself to do what it naturally knows how to do. Master Yuki nodded. "You came here to learn peace and compassion. But the first place to practice these qualities is with yourself. How can you offer kindness to others if you show nothing but harshness to your own heart? How can you find peace in meditation if you're at war with your own mind?" The teacher's voice was filled with gentle warmth. The path to awakening is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming kind. First to yourself, then to all beings. Your mind will wander during meditation. That's what minds do. They wander. The practice is not to stop this wandering, but to notice it with the same gentle affection you would show a beloved child who gets distracted while learning something new. She stood up slowly, preparing to continue her walk through the garden. When the child falls while learning to walk, do you yell at the child for falling? Do you call the child lazy and worthless? No. You help the child up with encouragement. You celebrate each small step. This is how you should treat your own mind as it learns to settle and become still. From that day forward, Miki changed her entire approach to practice. Instead of commanding her mind to focus, she would gently invite it back to the breath. Instead of criticizing wandering thoughts, she would acknowledge them with simple phrases like thinking or planning, and return to her meditation with kindness rather than force. When her body felt tired, instead of pushing through with grim determination, she would adjust her posture or take a brief break, treating her physical needs with respect. When emotions arose during sitting, instead of judging them as obstacles, she would breathe with them compassionately as she might comfort a friend in distress. The transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, Miki's meditation became naturally deeper and more peaceful. Her mind, no longer under constant attack, began to settle into the stillness she had been seeking. More importantly, the harsh inner critic that had tormented her for so long gradually softened into a voice of gentle encouragement and support. Her body became healthier as she started eating properly again. Her face, which had been tight with stress, became soft and open. Other students noticed the change and began asking her what had shifted. She would tell them simply, "I stopped going to war with myself. I started treating myself the way I would treat a dear friend." Years later, Miki became known as a compassionate teacher herself, someone who could help struggling students find their way to genuine peace. When asked about her teaching approach, she would say, "I learned that the kindness we show ourselves becomes the foundation for all the kindness we offer the world. We cannot give what we do not have. And we cannot find peace through violence, even when that violence is directed at ourselves." This story illuminates one of Buddhism's most essential teachings. Before we can truly help others or find lasting peace, we must learn to treat ourselves with the same gentleness and understanding we would offer to someone we deeply love. Most of us carry an inner critic that is harsher than we would ever be to a friend. This internal cruelty prevents us from accessing our natural wisdom and peace. Miki's journey shows us that self-compassion is not self-indulgence or making excuses for laziness. It's the recognition that we learn and grow more effectively in an atmosphere of kindness than in an atmosphere of constant judgment. When we stop waging war against our own imperfections, our minds naturally settle into the peace that was always there beneath the conflict. Master Yuki's teaching about the bird points to something profound. Animals don't carry this burden of self-criticism. They simply are what they are, doing what they do, without the extra layer of judgment we humans add. When we can approach our own experience with this same natural acceptance, we discover that peace is not something we achieve through force. It's something we allow by ending our internal violence. The Buddhist path teaches us that suffering often comes from our resistance to our own experience. When Miki fought against her wandering mind, she created more suffering than the wandering thoughts themselves ever could. When she learned to accept her mental patterns with kindness, the very same mind that had seemed chaotic began to reveal its natural clarity. Take a gentle breath and feel how this understanding creates a softening in your body. Notice what it might be like to meet your own imperfections with the same compassion you would offer a struggling friend. This is not lowering standards or giving up on growth. This is recognizing that love is a more powerful force for transformation than fear. The compassion that begins with ourselves naturally extends outward to embrace all beings. When we stop judging our own struggles, we become more patient with the struggles of others. When we learn to forgive our own mistakes, we develop the capacity to forgive those who have hurt us. When we discover that our own suffering deserves understanding rather than punishment, we begin to see that the same is true for everyone. Both Kenji and Miki discovered something essential about the nature of compassion in Zen Buddhism. Compassion is not just a pleasant feeling or a moral obligation. It is a deep understanding of the shared nature of suffering and a commitment to respond to that suffering with wisdom rather than judgment. Kenji saw that the thieves' harmful actions came from their own pain. Miki learned that her harsh self-criticism was creating the very suffering it claimed to be solving. Both found freedom by meeting suffering with understanding rather than punishment. This is the gift that Buddhist teachings offer, a way of relating to difficulty that doesn't add more pain to what is already painful. When we learn to respond with compassion, both to others and to ourselves, we stop being agents of additional suffering in the world. We become sources of healing instead. As you rest now, feel how this teaching settles in your heart. Notice any places where you might be holding yourself with harshness rather than kindness. What would it feel like to approach these areas the way Master Yuki approached Miki, with gentle understanding and patient encouragement? The peace that comes from this practice is profound because it doesn't depend on being perfect. It depends only on being kind. And kindness is something we can offer in any moment to ourselves and to all beings we encounter. This is the foundation of genuine peace, the peace that allows us to rest completely in who we are. One of the most practical and transformative teachings in Zen Buddhism is the practice of mindfulness. This word has become popular in recent years, but its meaning is often misunderstood. Mindfulness is not about achieving some special state of consciousness. It is not about emptying the mind or stopping thoughts. It is simply the practice of being completely present for whatever is happening right now. Most of us live with our attention divided. Our bodies are in one place, but our minds are somewhere else entirely. We eat without tasting. We walk without seeing. We listen without hearing. We go through our days on autopilot, lost in thoughts about the past or plans for the future, rarely fully present for the actual moment we are living. This divided attention is a major source of suffering. When our minds are always elsewhere, we never feel fully satisfied or at peace. We are like someone searching for their glasses while wearing them. What we seek is already here, but we cannot see it because we are not looking at where we actually are. Zen teaches us that peace is not found by changing our circumstances or achieving some future goal. It is found by learning to be completely present for this moment, exactly as it is. When we bring our full attention to whatever we are doing, even the most ordinary activities become rich and meaningful. A simple cup of tea becomes profound. A walk becomes meditation. A conversation becomes genuine connection. The practice of mindfulness is not complicated. It does not require special equipment or unusual abilities. It simply asks that we show up completely for our own lives, that we stop postponing our attention, waiting for some better moment to begin paying attention. This moment, right now, is the only moment we ever actually have. Let us explore this teaching through a story about a man who discovered that he had been missing his entire life by never being fully present for it. There once lived a young tea merchant named Taro who traveled from village to village selling the finest teas from distant mountains. His cart was filled with carefully wrapped packages of green tea, black tea, and rare flowering teas that bloomed like underwater flowers when steeped in hot water. Taro took great pride in his knowledge of tea and his ability to match each customer with the perfect blend for their taste. He had learned the tea trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. Taro could tell the quality of tea leaves by their appearance, their aroma, their texture between his fingers. He knew which teas came from which mountains, which were picked in spring and which in autumn, which were best for morning and which for evening. But Taro had a problem that he barely recognized. His mind was always somewhere else. While walking through one village, he would be thinking about the next village he needed to reach. While talking to customers about tea, he would be calculating profits or worrying about the weather for tomorrow's travel. While eating his evening meal, he would be planning the next day's route or replaying conversations from earlier in the day. This constant mental activity made Taro feel tired and scattered. He would often arrive in a new village, only to realize he couldn't remember anything about the journey there. The road had passed beneath his feet, but he had seen none of it. He would finish conversations with customers and immediately forget their names or what they had purchased. His life felt like a blur of constant motion without any real satisfaction or peace. Despite his success as a merchant, Taro felt empty. Each day was the same. Wake up, pack the cart, travel to the next village, sell tea, eat a quick meal, sleep, and start again. He kept thinking that happiness would come when he earned enough money, or when he could afford to slow down, or when he finally reached some undefined point in the future where his life would truly begin. One evening, as winter approached and the days grew shorter, Taro arrived in a mountain village just as the sun was setting. He was exhausted from a long day of travel and eager to find lodging for the night. As he walked through the quiet streets pulling his cart, he noticed a small tea house with warm light glowing from its windows. Inside, he could see an elderly woman sitting alone at a low table, slowly preparing tea with careful, deliberate movements. Something about her presence caught Taro's attention. She seemed completely absorbed in what she was doing, as if nothing else in the world existed except the tea ceremony unfolding before her. Taro knocked gently on the door and asked if he might shelter there for the night. The woman, whose name was Sachiko, welcomed him warmly and invited him to sit while she finished preparing the tea. She moved with a slowness that seemed almost ceremonial, but there was nothing stiff or formal about it. Each gesture appeared natural, effortless, complete. "I am a tea merchant," Taro said as he settled his tired body onto a cushion. "I have teas from all over the region. Perhaps you would like to try some of my finest varieties. I have a spring-picked silver needle white tea that is truly exceptional." Sachiko smiled gently and continued her slow, meditative movements. "Thank you for your generous offer," she said. "But first, would you join me in drinking this tea I have already prepared? It is just simple green tea, nothing fancy or expensive." Taro agreed, though he was eager to show off his premium selections. Sachiko poured the tea into small, humble clay cups that looked handmade. Their glaze was uneven, their shapes slightly irregular. She placed one cup before Taro with both hands, as if offering something precious. Then she lifted her own cup and took a slow, appreciative sip. Taro lifted his cup and took a quick drink, ready to comment on the quality and suggest improvements. His mind was already preparing his sales pitch. But before he could speak, Sachiko asked quietly, "What did you taste?" The question surprised Taro. "Well, it's green tea. Decent quality, though I have much better varieties in my cart. The leaves could be picked earlier in the season for a more delicate flavor, and the water temperature seems a bit high for this grade of tea, which brings out some bitterness that could be avoided if—" "No," Sachiko interrupted gently. I didn't ask you to analyze or compare. I asked what you tasted. Right now, in your mouth, what do you actually taste? Taro paused, confused. He lifted the cup again and took another sip, this time trying to focus on the actual sensations in his mouth. But his mind immediately began its familiar pattern of comparison and evaluation. This tea was not as refined as his best green teas. The water was indeed too hot. The leaves had been oversteeped slightly. Try once more, Sachiko suggested. But this time, drink as if you have never tasted tea before. As if this is the first sip of tea in your entire life. Taro found this instruction strange, but something in the woman's peaceful presence made him want to try. He lifted the cup very slowly. Watching the steam rise from its surface, he brought it to his lips and took the smallest possible sip. Instead of thinking about the tea, he tried to simply experience it. For the first time, he noticed the warmth spreading across his tongue. He felt the subtle astringency that made his mouth feel slightly dry. He detected a hint of sweetness that appeared after the initial bitterness faded. There was an earthy quality that reminded him of morning mist over mountain forests. He could taste the mineral content of the water, the slight grassiness of the leaves, even a faint nuttiness in the aftertaste. Now what did you taste? Sachiko asked. I actually tasted the tea, Taro said, surprised by his own response. Not my thoughts about the tea, but the tea itself. Sachiko nodded approvingly. Most people spend their whole lives drinking tea without ever really tasting it. They are so busy thinking about the tea, comparing it to other teas, judging whether they like it or not, that they miss the direct experience of drinking. She poured him another cup. Try again. This time, also notice what it feels like to hold the warm cup in your hands. Notice the sensation of swallowing. Pay attention to the steam rising from the surface. Taro spent the next hour drinking tea with a level of attention he had never experienced before. Each sip became a small meditation. He noticed how his breathing naturally slowed when he focused completely on the present moment. His racing thoughts settled into quiet appreciation for what was actually happening right now. He discovered that the temperature of the cup changed as he held it. He noticed the weight of the liquid in his mouth before swallowing. He felt the warmth traveling down his throat and spreading through his chest. He saw how the color of the tea changed slightly as it cooled. Each tiny detail became fascinating when he gave it his complete attention. This is how I learned to find peace, Sachiko told him as the evening grew late. Not by changing my circumstances, but by showing up fully for whatever was already here. I have been making tea in this same simple way for 30 years, and I discover something new every single time because I am truly present for the experience. She looked at him with kind eyes. You travel constantly, seeking success and security. But you are never where you actually are. Your body walks the roads, but your mind is always somewhere else. How can you find peace when you are never present for your own life? That night, Taro slept more deeply than he had in months. The next morning, as he prepared to continue his journey, he found that everything felt different. As he loaded his cart, he noticed the weight and texture of each package in his hands. As he walked through the village, he heard birds singing that he had never noticed before. The morning air felt fresh and alive against his skin. From that day forward, Taro's approach to his work completely changed. Instead of rushing through his days with his mind elsewhere, he began to practice what Sachiko had shown him. When talking with customers, he listened fully to their words instead of planning his next sales pitch. When walking from village to village, he noticed the changing landscape, the feel of his feet on the path, the rhythm of his breathing. He discovered that when he was truly present with customers, he could sense what they actually needed rather than just trying to sell them the most expensive tea. His genuine presence made people trust him. They felt heard and understood in his company. His business actually improved because he had stopped trying so hard and started paying attention. This simple shift in attention transformed not only Taro's experience of his work, but also his entire sense of well-being. The emptiness he had felt for years began to fill with a quiet satisfaction. He no longer felt like he was waiting for his life to begin. He realized his life had been happening all along, but he had been missing it by never being fully present. Years later, when people would ask Taro about the secret to his peaceful contentment, he would say, "I learned that happiness is not something you find by looking elsewhere. It's something you discover by being completely where you are." This story reveals the heart of mindfulness practice in Zen Buddhism. Taro's constant mental busyness prevented him from ever feeling satisfied or at peace. Even though he was living his life, walking roads, talking to people, eating meals, he was missing all of it because his attention was always somewhere else. Sachiko taught him something profound through the simple act of drinking tea. She showed him that the richness of life is available in every moment, but only when we are actually present to experience it. The same tea that Taro had drunk thousands of times before became a source of discovery and satisfaction when he finally showed up completely for the experience. This teaching extends to every corner of our lives. How often do we eat without tasting because we're reading or watching something? How often do we miss what someone is saying because we're already planning our response? How often do we walk through beautiful places without seeing them because we're lost in thought? The practice of mindfulness invites us to come back, again and again, to the simple reality of this present moment. Not as preparation for some future moment that will be better, but as the only moment we ever actually have. When we learn to be fully present, ordinary activities become extraordinary. The simple act of drinking tea, walking a path, or listening to another person becomes rich with meaning and satisfaction. Taro discovered that he had been postponing his life, always waiting for some future time when things would be different and he could finally be happy. But Sachiko showed him that the only time available for happiness is right now. Not later, after we achieve our goals or solve our problems. Right now, in this breath, in this step, in this moment of awareness. The practice of mindfulness is sometimes misunderstood as a technique only for peaceful moments. But Zen teaches us that presence is even more important during difficult times. Let us explore how mindfulness can transform our experience even when facing loss and grief. In a mountain village, there lived a master named Josen, who was known throughout the region for his ability to remain calm and centered no matter what was happening around him. Students would come from distant temples to learn from him, hoping to discover the secret of his unshakable peace. Master Josen's temple was a place of harmony and order. The daily routine was predictable and serene. Meditation in the morning, work in the gardens during midday, study in the afternoon, and evening ceremonies as the sun set. The community lived in rhythm with the seasons, each day flowing naturally into the next. Josen had been teaching at this temple for 20 years. He had trained many students, all of whom respected him deeply. But his most devoted student, a young monk named Kaku, was struggling with doubt about his teacher's reputation. Kaku had been living at the temple for 2 years, and while he found Master Josen to be wise and kind, he had never seen him face any real difficulties. The temple was peaceful, the community was harmonious, and their daily routine was predictable and comfortable. Everything in Josen's life seemed ideal. Kaku began to wonder if his teacher's calmness was simply the result of living in such protected circumstances. Anyone can be peaceful in a place like this, Kaku confided to his friend one evening. But what would happen if Master Josen faced real problems? Would he still be so calm if his world was turned upside down? It's easy to be serene when nothing bad ever happens. One autumn morning, Kaku's question was answered in a way he had not expected. A messenger arrived at the temple with devastating news. Bandits had attacked Master Josen's home village during the night. His elderly mother and younger brother, who still lived there, had been killed in the violence. The family home where Josen had grown up had been burned to the ground. Kaku watched his teacher's face carefully as he received this terrible news. For a moment, Josen's eyes filled with tears and his body seemed to sag with the weight of grief. But then, something remarkable happened. Instead of collapsing in despair or raging against the tragedy, Josen simply sat down on a nearby stone and began to breathe slowly and deeply. "Master," the messenger said urgently, "shouldn't you leave immediately? There may be arrangements to make, ceremonies to plan for your family." Josen nodded gently. "Yes, I will go. But first, I need a few moments to be present with this news and what it means." Kaku was amazed. His teacher was facing the worst possible tragedy, and yet he was not running around frantically or drowning in despair. Instead, he was sitting quietly, apparently paying careful attention to his own grief and shock. After several minutes of silent breathing, Josen stood up calmly. His face showed sadness, but also a kind of peaceful acceptance. "Kaku," he said, "please come with me. We will travel to my village together." During the long journey, Kaku expected his teacher to be lost in sorrow or distracted by planning. Instead, he found that Josen was more present and attentive than ever. When they stopped to rest, Josen noticed the changing colors of the autumn leaves. When they encountered other travelers, he listened to their stories with complete attention. When they shared simple meals, he ate with obvious appreciation for the food. "Master," Kaku finally asked, unable to contain his confusion, "how can you notice such small things when something so terrible has happened? Shouldn't you be too upset to pay attention to autumn leaves and simple meals?" Josen stopped walking and looked at his student with eyes that held both deep sadness and profound peace. "Kaku, this is exactly when mindful attention matters most. When we're overwhelmed by tragedy, our first instinct is to escape from the present moment. We get lost in thoughts about what we should have done differently, or we imagine all the ways the future will be ruined by this loss." He gestured to the forest path they were walking. But escaping into mental stories about the past or future doesn't help anyone. My mother and brother are gone, and no amount of mental anguish will bring them back. What I can do is honor their memory by staying fully present for whatever needs my attention right now. Josen picked up a fallen leaf and studied its intricate pattern of veins. If I spend this journey lost in thoughts of regret or worry, I miss the opportunity to appreciate the beauty they would have wanted me to see. If I'm too distracted by grief to listen carefully to the people we meet, I might miss chances to help someone who needs it. He looked directly at Kaku. Mindfulness is not about avoiding difficult emotions or pretending everything is fine. It's about being present for all of life, including the painful parts. When I sit with my grief mindfully, I can feel it completely without being destroyed by it. When I stay present even in sorrow, I remain available to respond wisely to whatever needs my care. When they reached the village, Kaku saw his teacher's wisdom in action. Because Josen was fully present for each conversation and decision, he was able to comfort other grieving families, arrange meaningful ceremonies, and handle practical matters with clarity and compassion. His mindful attention allowed him to be genuinely helpful during a time when many people would have been too overwhelmed to think clearly. That evening, as they sat by the graves of his mother and brother, Josen wept quietly. But even his tears seemed different from ordinary crying. They flowed naturally without the desperate grasping or bitter resentment that often accompanies grief. He was present for his sorrow without being consumed by it. "Now I understand," Kaku said softly. "You're not peaceful because you don't have problems. You're peaceful because you know how to be present with whatever problems arise." Josen nodded. Mindfulness doesn't make difficulties disappear, but it prevents us from making our difficulties worse by fighting against them or running away from them. When we can stay present even with pain, we discover that we're much stronger and more resilient than we realized. He placed his hand on his student's shoulder. "Life will bring joy and it will bring sorrow, success and failure, gain and loss. These are not things we can control. But we can learn to meet each experience with presence rather than resistance. And in that presence, we find a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances being pleasant." This profound story shows us that mindfulness is not a practice only for peaceful times. It becomes especially valuable during our most challenging moments because it prevents us from adding mental and emotional turmoil to whatever difficulties we're already facing. Josen's response to tragedy demonstrates that being present doesn't mean being emotionless or detached. He felt his grief fully, but didn't get lost in it. He experienced his sorrow without letting it take over his entire being. This is the balance that Zen Buddhism teaches. Neither suppressing our emotions nor being overwhelmed by them. When we face loss, disappointment, or crisis, our minds often make things worse by spinning stories. Stories about how terrible everything is, how unfair life is, how we'll never recover from this setback. These mental additions to our actual experience create much more suffering than the original problem ever could. Mindful presence offers a different way to meet difficulty. Instead of fighting against painful emotions or drowning in them, we can learn to be present with them. When we breathe with our sadness instead of resisting it, when we acknowledge our fear without being controlled by it, we discover that we can handle much more than we thought possible. Notice how Josen continued to appreciate the autumn leaves and simple meals even while grieving. This was not distraction or avoidance. It was his way of staying connected to life even in the midst of loss. By remaining present for both the sorrow and the beauty, he honored his family's memory while also staying available to help others. The teaching here is that we don't have to wait for life to become problem-free before we can find peace. We can learn to be at peace even in the midst of challenges by staying present for what's actually happening rather than getting lost in our stories about what's happening. As you rest now in this understanding, feel how the practice of presence creates a sense of groundedness. Even if your life contains challenges or uncertainties, This moment right now is manageable. You can breathe with whatever you're experiencing. You can be present for your own life as it unfolds. This is the gift that mindfulness offers in Zen Buddhism. Not the elimination of all problems, but the discovery that we can meet any problem with awareness and presence. Not the promise that life will always be comfortable, but the wisdom to find peace within whatever life brings. The path of mindfulness is simple, but not always easy. It asks us to come back, again and again, from our mental wandering to the reality of this present moment. But each time we return, we strengthen our capacity to be fully alive. Each time we choose presence over distraction, we deepen our experience of peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. In Zen Buddhism, there is an important distinction between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is something we collect in our minds. We read books, study teachings, memorize concepts. We become experts at explaining ideas and discussing philosophy. This kind of knowledge is valuable in its own way, but it often remains separate from our actual lived experience. Wisdom is something different. Wisdom comes not from accumulating more information, but from directly experiencing truth in our own lives. It emerges when we stop trying to understand everything with our thinking minds and start engaging with reality through our whole being. A person can know everything about swimming by reading books, but they only become wise about water when they actually get in and swim. Many people approach spiritual practice the way they approach school. They want to learn all the right concepts, memorize all the important teachings, and become experts who can answer any question. They believe that if they just study hard enough, they will eventually understand their way to enlightenment. But Zen points to something that cannot be fully captured in words or concepts. The ancient teachers used to say that the teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. The finger is useful because it shows us where to look. But if we spend all our time studying the finger, analyzing its shape and composition, we miss the moon entirely. The teachings are meant to guide us toward direct experience, not to replace it. This is why Zen masters are sometimes silent when asked profound questions. Not because they don't know the answer, but because they understand that some truths cannot be transmitted through words alone. They must be discovered through one's own direct experience. The teacher can point the way, but the student must walk the path themselves. Let us explore this wisdom through a story about a scholar who knew everything about truth, but had never directly encountered it. Deep in the mountains, there lived a scholar named Hayato who had devoted his entire life to studying Buddhist philosophy. His small house was packed from floor to ceiling with ancient texts, commentaries, and volumes of teachings from every school of Buddhist thought. He could recite complex philosophical arguments from memory and explain the most subtle points of doctrine with impressive precision. The house itself reflected his devotion to learning. Every wall had shelves built floor to ceiling. Scrolls filled wooden boxes stacked in corners. Manuscripts covered the low table where he worked. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air. Light filtered through a single window, illuminating dust motes that danced above piles of ancient wisdom. Hayato spent his days reading, taking notes, and writing his own commentaries on the great works of Buddhist literature. His shelves held texts in multiple languages. Sanskrit sutras sat beside Chinese commentaries. Tibetan treatises rested next to Japanese interpretations. He had studied under various teachers and attended countless lectures. He had devoted 40 years to understanding every aspect of Buddhist teaching. His routine never varied. He would rise before dawn, light a single lamp, and begin reading. He would work through the morning, pausing only for a simple meal of rice and vegetables. In the afternoon, he would write his own commentaries, carefully documenting his understanding of complex philosophical points. In the evening, he would review what he had written, checking his logic and references. When other scholars had questions about obscure points of philosophy, they would travel for days to consult with Hayato. He had answers for everything. Which sutra contained which teaching? How different schools interpreted the same concept? What the ancient masters had said about any given topic. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his memory sharp, his understanding of theory complete. He had developed a reputation as one of the most learned Buddhist scholars in the entire region. Students would occasionally make the difficult journey to his mountain retreat to study with him, hoping to benefit from his vast knowledge. Hayato would teach them about the different schools of thought, the historical development of Buddhist philosophy, the various interpretations of key concepts. But despite all his learning, Hayato felt something was missing. His understanding was complete in theory, but he often felt as confused about life as anyone else. When faced with daily problems or difficult emotions, his scholarly knowledge seemed to offer little practical help. He could explain the nature of suffering in elaborate detail, but he still suffered. He could describe the path to enlightenment perfectly, but he felt far from enlightened. Sometimes late at night, sitting alone among his books, Hayato would wonder if all his studying had actually brought him any closer to genuine peace. He knew so much, yet he felt he understood so little. One winter morning, an old woman appeared at Hayato's door. She was bent with age, dressed in simple peasant clothes, and carrying a small bundle of vegetables. She looked like any other village farmer, certainly not someone who would have anything to teach a great scholar. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a humble voice. "I've been walking all night through the snow, and I'm very cold and tired. Might I sit by your fire for a while to warm myself?" Hayato was annoyed by the interruption to his studies. He had been working on a particularly complex passage and didn't want to lose his concentration. But his Buddhist training had taught him the importance of compassion, so he reluctantly allowed the woman to enter and sit by his small hearth. As she warmed herself, the old woman noticed the books covering every surface of the room. Texts were piled on tables, stacked on shelves, spread open on the floor. "My," she said with apparent amazement, "you must be very wise to have read so many books about Buddhism." Hayato's chest swelled with pride. "Yes," he said, "I have studied Buddhist philosophy for over 30 years. I know the teachings of all the great masters. There is probably no question about Buddhist doctrine that I cannot answer." The old woman looked impressed. "How wonderful," she said. "I am just a simple farmer, but I have always wondered about something. Perhaps you could help me understand?" "Of course," Hayato said, pleased to have an opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge to someone who would surely be amazed by his wisdom. The woman was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then she asked, "What is Buddha?" Hayato launched into an elaborate explanation. He spoke about the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, about Buddha nature, about the three bodies of Buddha in Mahayana philosophy, about the distinction between the Buddha as a person and Buddha as an enlightened state. He quoted ancient texts and cited famous masters. He covered every aspect of Buddhahood that his scholarly training had taught him. The explanation took nearly an hour. Hayato felt satisfied with his thorough response. Surely this simple farmer would be impressed by the depth of his knowledge. When he finished, he looked at the old woman expectantly, waiting for her to express amazement at his learning. But she simply looked confused. "I'm sorry," she said apologetically, "but I still don't understand. You've told me many things about Buddha, but you haven't told me what Buddha is." Hayato felt a flash of irritation. "I just explained it in great detail. Perhaps you weren't listening carefully enough. Buddha is the awakened one, the one who achieved complete enlightenment, the teacher who showed us the path to liberation from suffering." "Yes, yes," the old woman interrupted gently, "but what is Buddha?" "Not what Buddha did or what Buddha teaches, but what Buddha is." Hayato tried again, this time using different terminology and approaching the question from various philosophical angles. He drew diagrams in the dust on his floor. He used metaphors and analogies. He referenced different schools of thought and their various interpretations. But no matter how he explained it, the woman kept asking the same simple question. "But what is Buddha?" After 2 hours of increasingly frustrated explanations, Hayato finally snapped. "Look, old woman, if you can't understand such basic Buddhist concepts, perhaps you should stick to farming and leave philosophy to those who are capable of grasping it." The elderly woman looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed much wiser and deeper than before. Her whole demeanor changed. "My dear scholar," she said softly, "you have spent 30 years learning about Buddha, but you have never met Buddha. You can describe Buddha perfectly, but you don't know what Buddha is." She stood up slowly and gathered her small bundle of vegetables. True understanding is not found in books or explanations. It's found in direct experience. You know what Buddha did and what Buddha taught, but you don't know what Buddha is because you have never looked inside yourself to find the Buddha nature that lives there. As she walked toward the door, she turned back with a gentle smile. "I am just a simple farmer, as you said. I cannot read your books or explain your philosophies. But when I work in my garden, I know Buddha. When I sit quietly in the evening, I meet Buddha. When I help a neighbor or feed a hungry animal, Buddha is there. I may not know about Buddha, but I know Buddha." With that, the old woman disappeared into the snowy morning, leaving Hayato alone with his thousands of books and his suddenly empty-feeling knowledge. For days afterward, Hayato could not concentrate on his studies. The woman's simple question kept echoing in his mind, "What is Buddha?" He realized that despite all his learning, he truly could not answer this most basic question from direct experience. He knew what others had said about Buddha. He could explain every philosophical interpretation, but he had never encountered Buddha directly in his own life. This encounter changed everything for Hayato. He didn't abandon his books entirely, but he began to balance his scholarly study with simple meditation practice. He started paying attention to his daily activities the way the old woman had described, looking for Buddha in ordinary moments rather than just in philosophical texts. Gradually, Hayato's understanding transformed from something he carried in his head to something he experienced in his heart. His knowledge became wisdom not because he learned new information, but because he began to live what he had always known intellectually. The words in his books remained the same, but now they pointed towards something he could recognize in his own experience. Years later, when students would come to study with him, Hayato would tell them, "Read the texts, yes. Study the teachings, of course. But never mistake the map for the territory. Knowledge about truth is not the same as knowing truth directly. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. This story illuminates one of Buddhism's most important teachings. We can study spiritual wisdom for decades and become experts at explaining it, but this kind of knowledge often remains separate from our actual lived experience. Hayato could describe Buddha perfectly in theoretical terms, but the old woman had something he lacked. She knew Buddha through direct encounter in her daily life. The old woman represents the kind of simple, direct wisdom that Zen values most highly. She might not have been able to give scholarly lectures about Buddha nature, but she knew it intimately through her own experience. Her understanding was living and present, not abstract and theoretical. Notice that the old woman didn't reject knowledge entirely. She acknowledged that Hayato's learning had value. But she pointed out what was missing. All his study had not brought him into direct contact with what the teachings were pointing toward. He had become so focused on understanding concepts that he had forgotten to look at what those concepts were describing. This teaching is especially important in our modern world, where we have access to more spiritual information than any previous generation. We can read thousands of books, watch countless videos, attend endless workshops about enlightenment and inner peace. But none of this accumulation of knowledge will bring us genuine wisdom unless we learn to experience what we're studying. The Buddhist path is not about becoming smarter about spirituality. It's about becoming more awake to the reality that's already present in each moment. When we try to understand our way to peace through thinking and analyzing, we often move further away from the direct experience that would actually bring us peace. Let us explore this teaching further through another story that shows how wisdom emerges not from having all the answers, but from living the questions. There was once a monastery where the monks were known for their intense debates about Buddhist philosophy. The monastery sat high on a mountain, surrounded by pine forests and reached by a steep stone path. Inside its walls, life followed a strict schedule. Morning meditation, work period, study time, and evening debates that often lasted until late at night. Every evening after their work was finished, the monks would gather in the main hall and engage in elaborate discussions about the nature of reality, the meaning of the teachings, and the proper interpretation of ancient texts. The hall would fill with voices, some calm and measured, others passionate and forceful. These debates were considered an important part of their training, a way to sharpen understanding and test the depth of their knowledge. A young monk named Goro particularly loved these debates. He had come to the monastery at age 15, and now, at 25, he had devoted a decade to intensive study. He was quick-witted and well-read, with a sharp memory and sharper tongue. He took great pride in his ability to win arguments and prove other monks wrong. When he scored a point in debate, his eyes would light up with satisfaction. When he spotted a flaw in another monk's reasoning, he would pounce on it immediately. He would spend his days preparing for the evening sessions. During the work period when other monks focused on their tasks, Goro's mind was composing arguments. During study time, he searched for passages that would support his positions. He had notebooks filled with quotes and references, all organized by topic, so he could quickly find the perfect response to any challenge. The other monks respected his intelligence, even those who found his competitive spirit tiresome. When Goro spoke, people listened. His arguments were well constructed, his references impeccable, his logic usually sound. He had become one of the monastery's star students, someone the abbot would point to as an example of diligent scholarship. One day, a new monk arrived at the monastery. His name was Tekkan, and he seemed different from the others. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with weathered hands that suggested years of hard physical work rather than scholarly study. During the evening debates, he would sit silently in the back, listening carefully but never participating in the discussions. This puzzled Goro. How could anyone sit through such fascinating philosophical conversations without wanting to contribute? After a week of watching Tekkan's silence, Goro decided to draw him into the debate. During a particularly heated discussion about the nature of emptiness, Goro turned to the newcomer and said, "Brother Tekkan, you've been listening to our discussions all week without saying a word. Surely you must have some opinion about whether phenomena are empty of inherent existence." All eyes turned to Tekkan, who looked slightly uncomfortable at being put on the spot. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I'm sorry, but I don't really understand what you mean by inherent existence. Could you explain it to me?" Goro was delighted. Here was a chance to display his knowledge to someone who was clearly less educated than himself. He launched into a detailed explanation of emptiness philosophy, using technical terms and citing ancient masters. His explanation was thorough, impressive, and quite complicated. When he finished, Tekkan nodded slowly. "Thank you for that explanation. But I'm still not sure I understand. Can you give me an example of something that has inherent existence and something that doesn't?" Goro was happy to oblige. He spent another 20 minutes providing examples and elaborating on his philosophical understanding. But when he finished, Tekkan asked another simple question that showed he still didn't quite grasp the concept. This pattern continued for several evenings. Tekkan would ask innocent questions that seemed to reveal his lack of sophisticated understanding, and Goro would respond with increasingly elaborate explanations. The other monks began to see Tekkan as somewhat simple, unable to grasp the complex ideas that they debated so skillfully. But something strange began to happen. As Goro tried to explain these concepts to someone who seemed to know nothing about philosophy, he found himself having to examine his own understanding more carefully. Tekkan's simple questions forced him to think about what he actually meant by the words he used so confidently. One evening, Tekkan asked a question that stopped Goro completely. They had been discussing emptiness for nearly an hour, with Goro explaining various philosophical interpretations with his usual confidence. The other monks were listening, some nodding along, others preparing their own responses. "Brother Goro, you've explained emptiness to me many times now, and I'm grateful for your patience," Tekkan said, his voice soft but clear. "But I wonder, when you're not explaining emptiness, when you're just living your daily life, how does this understanding change the way you experience washing dishes or sweeping floors?" Goro opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He sat there with his mouth slightly open, feeling suddenly exposed. He looked around at the other monks, hoping someone would jump in to help, but they too seemed uncertain. The question hung in the air like smoke. "I mean," Tekkan continued gently, "if we truly understand emptiness, shouldn't it change how we experience everything? When you sweep the meditation hall in the morning, does your understanding of emptiness make any difference to that experience? Or is it just an idea you think about during debates?" Goro felt his face grow warm. He realized that despite all his sophisticated explanations, his understanding of emptiness had never actually changed how he experienced ordinary activities. It remained an intellectual concept, something he could discuss brilliantly, but had never truly integrated into his lived experience. He could explain what emptiness meant in theory, but he had no idea how it felt in practice. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice much quieter than usual. The admission felt like defeat, but also strangely like relief. For the first time in years, he had spoken with genuine honesty rather than trying to display his knowledge. Tekkan smiled gently, his weathered face showing only kindness. "Thank you for your honesty. That takes more courage than clever arguments. You see, I spent 40 years as a farmer before coming here. I never learned the proper names for Buddhist concepts, and I can't engage in philosophical debates the way you do. My mind doesn't work that quickly, and I never had the chance to study books." He shifted his weight, his old knees creaking slightly. "But when I plant seeds in empty soil, I experience something that might be what you call emptiness. The soil looks empty, but it's actually full of potential. It's not nothing, but it's also not anything specific until seeds are planted and conditions come together. When I watch crops grow through their dependence on sun and rain and earth and my care, I see what you might call dependent origination. Nothing grows alone. Everything depends on everything else." He paused, looking around at the gathered monks with eyes that held both humility and a kind of quiet confidence. "I came here hoping to learn the names for what I had already experienced in my daily work. I wanted to be able to talk about these things the way you all do, to understand the philosophy behind what I'd lived. But I'm starting to think that maybe the names are not the most important thing. Maybe the experience is what matters most." The room fell silent. For the first time, many of the monks questioned whether their sophisticated debates were bringing them closer to wisdom or further from it. "Don't misunderstand me," Tekkan continued. "I'm not saying study is worthless. I'm grateful for all the explanations you've given me. But I wonder if sometimes we get so interested in talking about truth that we forget to live it." From that night forward, the character of the monastery's evening gatherings began to change. Instead of trying to win debates about concepts, the monks started sharing how their understanding affected their daily experience. Instead of competing to show off their knowledge, they began asking genuine questions about how to live with greater wisdom and compassion. Goro discovered that Tekkan's simple questions had been far more valuable than all his clever arguments. By forcing him to examine what his knowledge actually meant in practical terms, the older monk had helped him begin to transform intellectual understanding into lived wisdom. Years later, Goro would tell his own students, "The greatest teacher I ever met was an old farmer who asked simple questions and showed me that I had been studying the menu instead of tasting the food." This story reveals another crucial aspect of the difference between knowledge and wisdom in Buddhist teaching. Goro had accumulated vast amounts of information about Buddhist philosophy. He could explain complex concepts and win sophisticated arguments. But Tekkan, despite his lack of formal education, had something more valuable. He had directly experienced in his daily work what the philosophy was trying to describe. Tekkan's questions were not signs of stupidity or confusion. They were pointing toward a gap in Goro's understanding. The young monk could talk eloquently about emptiness, but he had never experienced how that understanding might transform his actual engagement with daily life. His knowledge remained abstract, disconnected from his lived experience. Notice how Tekkan approached his learning. He was not trying to collect information or win arguments. He was trying to connect the teachings to his own direct experience. When the monks spoke about dependent origination, He thought about how crops grow through multiple interconnected causes. When they discussed emptiness, he reflected on the relationship between seeds and soil. This is the kind of wisdom that Zen Buddhism values. Not the ability to explain teachings perfectly, but the capacity to recognize truth in one's own experience and to live accordingly. Tekkan might not have been able to write scholarly treatises, but he had done something more important. He had allowed spiritual insights to shape how he actually lived. The transformation that occurred in the monastery shows what happens when we shift from accumulating knowledge to cultivating wisdom. The monks stopped treating spiritual teachings as abstract concepts to be debated and started treating them as practical guidance for how to live. Their understanding deepened not because they learned new information, but because they began connecting what they knew to their actual experience. This teaching offers profound relief because it means we don't need to become scholars or experts to benefit from Buddhist wisdom. We don't need to understand every philosophical nuance or memorize complex texts. We simply need to take whatever understanding we have, however basic, and begin applying it to our actual experience. As you rest in this teaching now, notice the difference between thinking about peace and actually experiencing it in this moment. Feel how wisdom emerges not from collecting more information about truth, but from being present to the truth of your own direct experience right now. The Zen path invites us to move from knowing about life to knowing life directly, from understanding concepts to experiencing reality, from studying the finger that points at the moon to looking at the moon itself. This shift from knowledge to wisdom is not about abandoning learning, but about allowing what we learn to transform how we actually live, moment by moment. In Zen Buddhism, there is a teaching about non-attachment that is often misunderstood. Many people think non-attachment means not caring about anything, becoming cold or indifferent, withdrawing from life. But this is not what Zen teaches at all. True non-attachment means engaging fully with life while holding our preferences lightly. It means caring deeply about things without being enslaved by our need to control them. It means loving without possessing, working toward goals without being destroyed if we don't achieve them, enjoying what we have without living in constant fear of losing it. Think of how a child holds a butterfly. If they grip too tightly, they crush it. If they don't care at all, they never get to experience its beauty. But if they hold their hand open and let the butterfly rest there freely, they can appreciate it fully while also allowing it to fly away when it's ready. This is the balance that non-attachment points toward. We suffer not because we love things, but because we try to own them completely. We suffer not because we have preferences, but because we demand that reality conform to those preferences. When we grasp tightly at anything, whether it's an object, a person, an experience, or even an idea, we plant the seeds of our own anxiety. The tighter we grip, the more we fear losing what we hold. Zen teaches us that everything in life is temporary. Everything changes. Everything passes. This is not a sad truth, but simply the nature of reality. When we try to freeze moments, to make permanent what is naturally flowing, we create suffering for ourselves. But when we can appreciate things fully while they're here and release them gracefully when they go, we discover a freedom that no amount of control could ever provide. This teaching transforms how we relate to everything we value. Our work becomes more fulfilling when we stop being enslaved by our need for success. Our relationships become more loving when we stop trying to control and possess the people we care about. Our possessions bring more joy when we hold them lightly appreciating them while we have them and releasing them peacefully when the time comes. Let us explore this wisdom through a story about a man who discovered that losing what he held most dear actually freed him from a prison he didn't know he was in. A fisherman named Ichiro lived in a small coastal village where his family had fished the same waters for generations. The village sat at the edge of a bay where the sea was usually calm in the morning and grew rougher as the day progressed. Everyone in the village made their living from the ocean in one way or another. Ichiro owned a beautiful boat that his grandfather had built by hand 50 years ago. The boat was made of sturdy cedar wood with carved wooden details along the rails and a sail that his grandmother had woven from the strongest fibers. The wood had been oiled and cared for so well that it still looked almost new. This boat was not just his livelihood, but his pride and joy, his most treasured possession. Every week, Ichiro would spend hours polishing the boat's wood until it gleamed in the sunlight. He would mend the smallest tear in the sail immediately. He would check every rope, every joint, every plank to make sure everything was in perfect condition. Other fishermen would sometimes joke that Ichiro loved his boat more than he loved fishing. Ichiro was known throughout the village as the most successful fisherman. His nets always seemed to find the richest schools of fish. His knowledge of the ocean's moods and patterns was unmatched. He knew where the fish would be at different times of day, in different seasons, under different weather conditions. Other fishermen would watch him launch his boat each morning and hope to learn his secrets. But Ichiro's success came at a cost. He had become so attached to his boat and his reputation that fishing was no longer enjoyable. Every morning he would wake up worried about the weather. Was it too windy? Would a storm damage his precious boat? He would lie in bed calculating whether the conditions were safe enough to risk taking his boat out. On the water, his attachment to catching fish made him tense and calculating. He would become frustrated when other fishermen had good luck in areas where he found nothing. He would feel angry with himself when a net came up light. He would cut his trips short if the fishing seemed slow, afraid he was wasting time. Or he would push himself to exhaustion when the fish were biting well, afraid to miss any opportunity. At night, he couldn't sleep well because he worried about his boat. Was it securely tied? Would someone try to steal it? Would rats gnaw through the ropes? He would sometimes get up in the middle of the night and walk down to the docks just to check on it. One morning, Ichiro woke before dawn as usual and walked down to the docks to prepare for his day's fishing. But when he reached his usual spot, his heart stopped. The space where his boat should have been was empty. Just dark water reflecting the pre-dawn sky. He looked around frantically. Perhaps he had misremembered where he tied it. Perhaps someone had moved it for repairs. But no. The cut rope was still there, tied to the post. Someone had taken his boat during the night, cutting it free and sailing it away while the village slept. Ichiro stood on the dock staring at the empty space, feeling as if his whole identity had vanished with the boat. That boat had been in his family for 3 generations. It represented his grandfather's craftsmanship, his father's teaching, his own skill as a fisherman. Without it, who was he? Other fishermen in the village felt sorry for Ichiro when they heard the news. They offered to help search for the boat, though everyone knew it was probably long gone. Some offered sympathy. Others offered advice about how he might afford a new boat someday. But most of their boats were barely large enough for one person, let alone 2. Only old Saburo, whose tiny, rickety fishing boat was held together with patches and rope, offered to take Ichiro out with him. Saburo was the poorest fisherman in the village, barely catching enough to feed himself. Ichiro had always looked down on Saburo's poor equipment and modest catches. The old man's boat was small and weathered, its paint peeling, its wood soft with age. His nets were so old and mended that they seemed to be made more of patches than original material. Saburo never caught much, never accumulated anything, and never seemed bothered by his poverty. But, with no other options, Ichiro reluctantly accepted the offer. As they paddled out in Saburo's leaky little boat, Ichiro felt embarrassed and anxious. How could he catch fish with such inadequate equipment? What if other fishermen saw him in this pathetic vessel? His reputation as a successful fisherman would be ruined. The boat was so small that they sat close together. Water sloshed in the bottom, and Saburo would occasionally pause to bail it out with a wooden cup. The oars were mismatched, one longer than the other. The sail had so many patches, it looked like a quilt. Everything about it spoke of poverty and failure to Ichiro's eyes. But something unexpected happened once they reached the fishing grounds. Without his perfect boat and carefully maintained equipment to worry about, Ichiro found himself paying attention to things he had never noticed before. He watched the way Saburo read the water, not through sophisticated knowledge, but through simple, quiet observation. The old man would sit perfectly still for long minutes, just listening to the rhythm of the waves and feeling the movement of the current beneath them. He would watch how seabirds flew and where they dove. He would notice the color and texture of the water's surface. When he cast his patched nets, he did so without any sense of urgency or attachment to the outcome. If the nets came up empty, Saburo would simply smile and try another spot. "The fish are elsewhere today," he would say calmly. If they came up full, he would give thanks and continue his work. There was no frustration with failure, no grasping at success. Just steady, peaceful work. "Saburo," Ichiro asked, "aren't you worried that your nets might tear? They look like they could fall apart at any moment." The old man chuckled, his weathered face creasing into smile lines. "They might. They've torn many times before, and I've mended them. If they tear today, I'll mend them tonight. If they fall apart completely, I'll make new ones somehow. The fish don't care how pretty the nets are. They don't ask to see credentials before they swim into them." As the day progressed, Ichiro found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. Without his own equipment to maintain and protect, he could simply focus on the experience of fishing itself. He began to remember why he had loved being on the water as a child, before fishing became about success and reputation and the fear of losing what he had. He noticed the smell of the salt air. He felt the sun warm on his shoulders. He heard the cry of gulls and the splash of fish jumping. He saw the way light moved on the water's surface. All these things had been there every day of his fishing life, but he had been too worried and distracted to notice them. To his amazement, they caught more fish that day than he had caught in weeks with his sophisticated boat and equipment. The old patched nets pulled up full again and again. But more importantly, he enjoyed the experience in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. "How is this happening?" Ichiro asked Saburo as they pulled in another heavy net. "Your equipment is so old and simple, but we're having such success." Saburo smiled as he sorted through the catch. "Maybe it's because I'm not afraid of losing anything. My boat is already falling apart, so I don't worry about scratching it." My nets are already patched, so I don't fear tearing them. When you're not protecting anything, you can focus completely on what you're doing. He paused, looking at Ichiro with kind eyes. You had a beautiful boat, my friend. But you spent so much energy worrying about it that you forgot to enjoy fishing. You were so afraid of losing what you had that you lost your peace of mind instead. That evening, as they returned to shore with their good catch, Ichiro realized something profound. The loss of his boat had freed him from something he hadn't even known was imprisoning him. His attachment to his perfect equipment had been preventing him from fishing with the natural ease and attention that actually brought both success and satisfaction. Over the following weeks, while he waited to see if his stolen boat would be recovered, Ichiro continued fishing with Saburo. Each day brought new discoveries. He learned to read the water through patient observation rather than anxious analysis. He learned to cast nets without worrying about outcomes. He learned to appreciate the simple act of being on the water rather than constantly measuring his success. When his boat was eventually found abandoned on a beach 2 villages away, Ichiro faced an interesting choice. He could return to his old way of fishing with all its anxiety and attachment. Or he could continue with the freedom he had discovered in Saburo's simple approach. He chose to keep his boat, but to fish with a different attitude. He still maintained his equipment carefully, but he no longer lived in fear of losing it. He still worked to catch fish, but he didn't let his success or failure determine his peace of mind. He had learned the difference between caring for something and being enslaved by it. Years later, when young fishermen would ask Ichiro for advice, he would tell them, "Take good care of your equipment, but don't let your equipment take care of you. Love your work, but don't let your work become your master." The best fishing happens when you're not afraid of coming home empty-handed. This story reveals one of Buddhism's most liberating insights about attachment. Ichiro's love for his boat was not the problem. The problem was his clinging, his constant anxiety about protecting and maintaining it, his fear of loss. This attachment turned what should have been a source of joy into a source of suffering. Saburo showed him what non-attachment looks like in practice. The old fisherman cared about his work and took care of his equipment as best he could. But he held everything lightly. His boat was falling apart, but he didn't agonize over it. His nets were patched, but he didn't fear their imperfection. This freedom allowed him to fish with complete presence and natural ease. Notice that Saburo was not indifferent or careless. He mended his nets when they tore. He bailed water from his boat. He worked hard and did his best. Non-attachment doesn't mean not caring. It means caring without being controlled by fear of loss. Ichiro discovered that his attachment had actually been making him a worse fisherman. His constant worry prevented him from being fully present for his work. His fear of failure made him tense and calculating rather than natural and intuitive. His need to protect his possessions consumed energy that could have gone into simply fishing well. This teaching applies to everything we value in life. How much energy do we waste protecting and controlling things instead of simply enjoying them? How often does our fear of loss prevent us from fully experiencing what we have right now? How many opportunities do we miss because we're too busy clinging to what we already possess? The Buddhist path teaches that true security comes not from successfully controlling everything, but from releasing the need to control. When we can hold our possessions, our relationships, our achievements lightly, we discover a freedom that no amount of grasping could provide. Let us explore this teaching further through another story that shows how non-attachment can transform even our relationship with our own identity. In a large city, there lived a woman named Ryonen who was widely regarded as one of the most beautiful and accomplished women of her generation. She had been born into a wealthy merchant family and had received the finest education available. She had mastered poetry, calligraphy, music, and dance. Her beauty was legendary, and many wealthy men sought her hand in marriage. Ryonen's father took great pride in his daughter. He would hold parties where she would perform for guests. Her poetry would be read aloud in literary circles. Her name was known throughout the city as someone exceptional, someone to be admired and envied. But as Ryonen grew into adulthood, she felt increasingly trapped by her beauty and accomplishments. People never seemed to see her, only her appearance and talents. Men wanted to possess her like a beautiful object. Women either envied her or wanted to befriend her for status. No one seemed interested in who she actually was beneath the surface. More deeply, Ryonen felt called to a spiritual life. She wanted to practice Zen Buddhism seriously, to dedicate herself to understanding the nature of mind and reality. But whenever she mentioned this to her family or friends, they would laugh. Why would someone as beautiful and privileged as you want to become a nun? You could marry a wealthy man, have a comfortable life, continue your artistic pursuits. Don't waste your gifts. Despite her family's objections and society's expectations, Ryonen decided to pursue her spiritual calling. She approached several Zen monasteries, requesting to be accepted as a nun. But none would take her. The abbots would take one look at her exceptional beauty and refuse her entry. Your appearance would be too distracting for the monks, they would tell her. You should marry and live a conventional life. The monastic path is not suitable for someone like you. After being rejected by the 7th monastery, Ryonen understood something painful. Her physical beauty, which everyone else saw as a gift, had become an obstacle to what she most wanted in life. People's attachment to her appearance and society's attachment to it was preventing her from living according to her true calling. She sat for many days considering what to do. She thought about disguising herself, perhaps wearing plain clothes and covering her face. But she knew that wouldn't be enough. The problem wasn't just how others saw her. It was how she herself had become identified with her appearance and accomplishments. Beauty had become her identity, and she needed to free herself from that identity. One night, Ryonen made a radical decision. She went to her family's kitchen and heated a large iron pot until it glowed red hot. Then, without hesitation, she pressed the metal against her face. The physical pain was intense, but brief. The emotional liberation was immediate and lasting. She had freed herself from the burden of exceptional beauty that had defined her entire life. She was no longer the beautiful Ryonen, but simply Ryonen, a woman seeking spiritual understanding. When she appeared at the next monastery with her scarred face, the abbot looked at her differently. He saw not a beautiful woman who might distract his monks, but a serious seeker who had demonstrated the depth of her commitment. He accepted her immediately. In the years that followed, Ryonen became known not for her appearance but for her wisdom and depth of practice. She wrote poetry that captured profound insights. Her teaching helped many students understand the path. She was respected for who she was, not what she looked like. Students would sometimes ask Ryonen if she regretted destroying her beauty. She would smile and say, "I destroyed nothing. I only freed myself from a prison." The beauty that mattered was always on the inside, but I couldn't see it while everyone was focused on my face. But the most profound part of Ryanan's story came near the end of her life. A young nun approached her and said, "Master, I admire your sacrifice, but I cannot imagine being brave enough to destroy my appearance as you did. How did you find such courage?" Ryanan looked at her student with eyes full of gentle wisdom. "I did not destroy my appearance out of courage," she said. "I destroyed it out of attachment. I was so attached to becoming a nun that I was willing to sacrifice anything to achieve that goal." The young nun looked confused. "But isn't dedication to spiritual practice a good thing?" "Dedication, yes," Ryanan replied, "but not attachment. When I scarred my face, I thought I was showing my commitment to practice. But I was actually showing my attachment to a particular identity, that of being a nun. I traded one form of attachment for another." She paused, looking out at the monastery garden where flowers bloomed and faded according to their natural cycles. True freedom comes not from changing our external circumstances, but from releasing our grip on all identities. The understanding I sought by becoming a nun was already present when I was a beautiful woman in my father's house. I simply couldn't see it because I was too attached to my appearance. "So was your sacrifice meaningless?" the student asked. Ryanan smiled. "No, it was necessary for me at that time. Sometimes we must go to extremes to learn what balance means. My scarred face taught me something that no amount of studying could have revealed. It showed me that freedom comes not from changing what we look like or what role we play, but from changing how tightly we hold on to these things." This profound story reveals multiple layers of teaching about attachment and identity. Ryanan's initial attachment to her beauty prevented her from pursuing the spiritual life she desired. But in a deeper way, her later attachment to becoming a nun led her to an extreme action that, while effective in achieving her goal, was itself another form of clinging. The deepest wisdom in her story comes from her mature understanding. True freedom doesn't require us to destroy or change our circumstances. It requires us to change our relationship to those circumstances. We can be beautiful or scarred, wealthy or poor, accomplished or ordinary, and find the same liberation through releasing our attachment to these conditions. This teaching is especially important in our modern world, where identity has become such a central concern. We define ourselves by our appearance, our achievements, our roles, our status. We think we are our job title, our relationship status, our physical attributes, our social position. But Zen wisdom teaches that these identities, while practically useful, are not our true nature. Ryanan's journey shows that we can become attached even to spiritual identity. We can cling to being a good practitioner, an enlightened person, someone who has transcended worldly concerns. These spiritual attachments can be just as binding as worldly ones. The freedom that Buddhism points toward is freedom from all fixed identity, not becoming a different person, but releasing the tight grip we have on being any particular person. When we stop clinging to who we think we are or who we think we should be, we discover a natural ease that allows us to respond appropriately to each situation without the burden of maintaining an image. Notice that Ryanan didn't regret her actions. They had been necessary for her journey, but she had learned something beyond them. She learned that true freedom is always internal, not dependent on changing external conditions. Whether beautiful or scarred, nun or laywoman, the same peace was available through releasing attachment. As you rest in this teaching now, feel what it might be like to hold your own identity a bit more lightly. Not abandoning who you are, but releasing some of the tight grip you have on maintaining a particular self-image. Notice how this creates space, how it allows breath to flow more freely. Non-attachment in Zen Buddhism is not about having nothing or caring about nothing. It's about engaging fully with life while remaining free. Free from the anxiety of loss. Free from the burden of constant control. Free from being enslaved by our own preferences. This freedom allows us to love more deeply because we're not trying to possess, to work more effectively because we're not paralyzed by fear of failure, to live more fully because we're not constantly protecting and defending what we have. One of the most profound teachings in Zen Buddhism concerns the nature of impermanence. Everything changes. Everything passes. Nothing stays the same. This might sound like a sad teaching, something to mourn or resist. But Zen shows us that impermanence is actually one of life's greatest gifts. We suffer when we try to hold on to things that are naturally flowing. We suffer when we demand that pleasant moments last forever or that difficult moments never arrive. We suffer when we forget that change is not the enemy of happiness, but the very condition that makes happiness possible. Think about it carefully. If beautiful moments lasted forever, they would lose their beauty. If spring bloomed eternally, we would stop noticing the flowers. If the sun never set, we would take its light for granted. The temporary nature of experiences is what gives them their preciousness and power to move us. A flower is beautiful partly because it will fade. A sunset is precious partly because it will end. A moment with a loved one is meaningful partly because our time together is limited. When we truly understand this, impermanence stops being something to fear and becomes something that enriches every moment. The problem is that we spend much of our lives pretending things will last forever. We accumulate possessions as if we'll keep them eternally. We act as if we have unlimited time with the people we love. We postpone important conversations and meaningful experiences, assuming there will always be another opportunity. Then, when change comes, as it inevitably does, we feel shocked and betrayed. But Zen teaches us to live with full awareness of impermanence. Not in a morbid way, dwelling on endings, but in a way that brings each moment into sharp focus. When we remember that this conversation might be our last with this person, we listen more carefully. When we remember that this season will pass, we appreciate it more fully. When we accept that our own time is limited, we stop postponing our lives and begin actually living them. This teaching transforms everything. Instead of being paralyzed by the knowledge that good times won't last forever, we become liberated by it. Each moment becomes precious precisely because it won't come again. Each experience becomes meaningful because it's temporary. Each breath becomes a gift because we know we don't have infinite breaths. Let us explore this wisdom through a story about a gardener who learned that fighting against natural cycles creates suffering, while accepting them brings peace. There once lived a master gardener named Yuki, who was famous throughout the region for creating the most beautiful gardens anyone had ever seen. Her specialty was cherry trees, and people would travel from distant provinces just to walk through her gardens during the brief cherry blossom season. Yuki had spent 40 years perfecting her art. She knew exactly which varieties of cherry trees would bloom at different times, creating waves of color that lasted for weeks instead of days. She understood how to shape the trees so their blossoms would frame mountain views perfectly. She had created stone paths that guided visitors to see each tree from its most beautiful angle. Her gardens were not just collections of trees. They were carefully composed landscapes where every element worked together. Water features reflected the blossoms. Stone lanterns provided focal points. Moss gardens created green backgrounds that made the pink and white flowers seem even more vibrant. Visitors would walk through in reverent silence, overwhelmed by the beauty surrounding them. But Yuki had a problem that troubled her deeply. Every year, just as her gardens reached their peak beauty, the cherry blossoms would begin to fall. Within days, sometimes within hours if the wind was strong, the magnificent display she had worked all year to create would be gone. The ground would be covered with fallen petals, and the trees would show only green leaves where stunning flowers had been. The fleeting nature of the blossoms filled her with sadness and frustration. Why must something so beautiful last such a short time? She would ask herself as she swept fallen petals from her carefully designed paths. If only I could make the blossoms stay longer, then people could truly appreciate their beauty. Yuki began experimenting with ways to extend the blooming period. She tried different fertilizers, hoping to strengthen the flowers' attachment to their branches. She built small shelters around certain trees to protect the blossoms from wind and rain. She even attempted to coat some petals with a thin substance to preserve them longer. But nothing worked. The cherry blossoms followed their natural rhythm, blooming gloriously and then falling away, completely indifferent to her efforts to control them. Each spring, she would watch the peak bloom approach with mixed feelings. Joy at seeing the beauty emerge, but also dread at knowing how soon it would end. She would spend the days of full bloom anxiously watching for signs that petals were beginning to fall. She couldn't fully enjoy the moment because she was already mourning its passing. One spring morning, as Yuki was sadly sweeping up another pile of fallen petals, an old monk appeared on the path. He was walking slowly, stopping frequently to look at the trees with a gentle smile. Most of the blossoms had already fallen. Only a few remained on the highest branches. Yuki felt embarrassed that this visitor had arrived too late to see her garden at its best. "Excuse me," Yuki called to him. "You've come too late. The peak blooming was last week. There's not much left to see now." The monk looked surprised. "Too late? But I can see many beautiful things right now." He gestured toward a tree where the last few blossoms clung to branches that were already showing fresh green leaves. "Look how lovely this is, the old blossoms saying goodbye while new life begins." Yuki looked where he was pointing, but saw only the remnants of what had been much more beautiful days earlier. "But you should have seen it last week when all the trees were in full bloom." That was when it was truly magnificent. The old monk smiled and sat down on a stone bench beneath the nearly bare tree. He invited Yuki to sit with him. "Tell me about that perfect day," he said. Yuki's face lit up as she described the peak bloom. Every tree was covered in perfect flowers. The air was filled with their delicate fragrance. Visitors walked the paths in wonder, some of them with tears in their eyes from the beauty. It was like paradise itself. "It sounds wonderful," the monk said. "And how did you feel during that perfect day?" Yuki paused, remembering. Her expression became troubled. "I felt anxious, actually. Even while people were praising the beauty, I was worried about how long it would last. I kept looking for signs that the petals were beginning to fall. I couldn't fully enjoy the moment because I was already dreading its end. The monk nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you feel now, a week later?" "Sad. Empty. Like the whole year of work was wasted because the beauty was so brief. Like all my effort was for nothing." The old monk was quiet for a long moment, watching a few remaining petals drift slowly to the ground. Then he asked, "What if the shortness of the blooming is not the enemy of beauty, but the source of it?" Yuki looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Tell me," the monk said, "would people travel from distant provinces to see cherry blossoms if they bloomed all year long? Would visitors walk your paths with tears in their eyes if the flowers lasted for months? Would you treasure the sight of full bloom if it was always available?" Yuki had never considered this perspective. "I suppose not. If cherry blossoms bloomed constantly, they would become ordinary." "Exactly," the monk smiled. "The very thing that causes you sadness, the brief nature of the blossoms, is what makes them so precious. Their beauty is not despite their impermanence, but because of it. When people see cherry blossoms, they are not just seeing pretty flowers. They are seeing the beautiful truth that all things pass away, and this knowledge makes the sight even more meaningful and poignant." He gestured toward the nearly bare tree above them. "This tree will give you a new gift now. In a few weeks, it will offer fresh green shade for summer visitors. In autumn, it will display brilliant colored leaves. In winter, it will show you the elegant structure of its bare branches against snow. Each season has its own beauty, but only because each season lets go when its time is finished." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Yuki began to see her garden with different eyes. The fallen petals on the path were not just debris to be cleaned up. They were evidence of beauty that had been fully expressed and completed. The few remaining blossoms were not inferior remnants, but the final notes of a song that had been perfectly sung. "I have been fighting against the very thing that makes my garden special," she realized aloud. "I wanted to stop time at the moment of peak beauty, but that would destroy what makes the beauty powerful." The monk stood up to continue his walk. "The cherry blossoms have been teaching the deepest truth about life for centuries. They show us that because things pass away, each moment is irreplaceable. Because beauty is temporary, it deserves our complete attention and appreciation. When we truly understand impermanence, we don't love things less. We love them more fully." From that day forward, Yuki's relationship with her garden completely transformed. She still worked carefully to create the best conditions for blooming. She still designed beautiful compositions and maintained her paths. But she no longer fought against the natural cycle of flowering and fading. During peak bloom, instead of worrying about when it would end, she would sit quietly among the trees and drink in their beauty completely. She gave herself permission to feel the full joy of the moment without the shadow of future loss hanging over it. When the petals began to fall, instead of feeling sad, she would appreciate the graceful way the blossoms completed their brief dance. She even began to see beauty in the falling itself. The way wind would lift clouds of petals into the air. The patterns they made as they drifted down. The soft carpet they created on the ground. Each stage of the cycle had its own particular beauty that she had been missing while wishing for something different. Visitors noticed the change in Yuki. She seemed more present and peaceful, more able to share in their wonder rather than being preoccupied with maintenance and control. The garden itself didn't change, but the gardener's relationship with it did. And somehow this made the whole experience more beautiful. Years later, people would say that Yuki's gardens taught them not just about cherry blossoms, but about life itself. They learned that trying to hold on to beautiful moments destroys them, that accepting impermanence enriches every experience, that the temporary nature of things is what makes them precious. This story reveals one of Buddhism's most transformative teachings about impermanence. Yuki was suffering not because the blossoms faded, but because she resisted their fading. Her fight against natural cycles created constant anxiety that prevented her from enjoying even the moments of peak beauty. The monk helped her see what she had been missing. The brief nature of cherry blossoms is not a flaw to be corrected. It's an essential part of what makes them meaningful. If they bloomed year-round, they would lose their power to move us. Their temporary nature concentrates their beauty, makes each viewing precious, reminds us of the larger truth about all of life. When Yuki stopped fighting impermanence and learned to work with it, everything changed. She could finally be fully present during peak bloom because she wasn't wasting energy trying to make it last forever. She could appreciate the falling petals because she wasn't demanding they stay on the branches. She found peace not by changing the garden's natural cycles, but by changing her relationship to those cycles. This teaching applies to every area of our lives. We cause ourselves suffering when we demand that pleasant experiences last forever. We miss the beauty of each moment because we're anxiously trying to preserve it. We can't fully enjoy time with loved ones because we're already dreading their eventual loss. But when we truly accept impermanence, a remarkable shift occurs. Instead of being diminished by the knowledge that things will end, our experience is enriched. We pay closer attention because we know each moment is unrepeatable. We love more fully because we understand our time is limited. We stop postponing appreciation until some future moment and begin appreciating what's here right now. Let us explore this teaching further through a story about how accepting the reality of death can paradoxically make us more alive. In a mountain village, there lived an old doctor named Nobu who had spent his entire career caring for the people of his community. For over 40 years, he had delivered their babies, treated their illnesses, and comforted their families through times of loss. He was deeply loved and respected by everyone who knew him. Now, in his 70s, Dr. Nobu developed a serious illness of his own. After many tests, he received news that no doctor wants to hear. His condition was terminal. The disease could not be cured. He had perhaps 6 months left to live, maybe less. Many people expected Dr. Nobu to become depressed or angry about his diagnosis. After spending his life healing others, it seemed unfair that he should face a disease that couldn't be healed. His friends and colleagues prepared themselves to support him through what they assumed would be a difficult time of grief and fear. But something surprising happened instead. Dr. Nobu seemed to come alive in a way that people had never seen before. Instead of withdrawing into sadness, he became more present and engaged than he had been in years. Every morning, he would wake up and spend time looking out his window at the mountains, as if seeing them for the first time. He would watch the sunrise with complete attention, noting every shift in color, every change in light. He would savor his simple breakfast of rice and tea with obvious pleasure, paying attention to tastes and textures he had barely noticed for decades. When neighbors came to visit, bringing food or offering comfort, he would listen to their stories with complete attention. He seemed genuinely interested in every detail of their lives. He would ask questions and remember small things they had mentioned in previous conversations. Each visitor left feeling that they had received more than they had given. Dr. Nobu also began doing things he had always said he didn't have time for. He started painting watercolors of the mountain views from his house. He wrote long letters to old friends he hadn't contacted in years. He spent hours sitting with children in the village, telling them stories and listening to their concerns and dreams. His assistant, a young nurse named May, who had worked with him for several years, was puzzled by this transformation. One afternoon, as Dr. Nobu was carefully painting a picture of a single flower in a small vase, she finally asked him about the change she had observed. "Doctor, forgive me for asking, but you seem happier now than I've ever seen you, even though you're facing such a difficult situation. How is this possible?" Dr. Nobu set down his brush and smiled at the young woman. "May, do you know what I discovered when I learned I was dying?" "What?" "I discovered that I had been dying all along. We all are. The only difference is that now I know approximately how much time I have left, and this knowledge has become a great teacher." May looked confused, so Dr. Nobu continued. "For 70 years, I lived as if I had unlimited time. I would put off conversations with old friends, thinking I would call them next month. I would rush through meals to get to the next task, assuming I could enjoy food properly someday when I wasn't so busy. I would notice beautiful sunsets but barely pause to appreciate them, believing there would always be another sunset tomorrow." He gestured toward the flower he had been painting. "But when you know your time is limited, everything becomes precious. This flower will fade in a few days, and I might not be here to see many more flowers after that. So I paint it now, with complete attention, giving it the respect it deserves as one of the last flowers I may ever really see." Dr. Nobu stood up and walked to the window. "Look at those mountains, May. I have seen them every day for 40 years, but I was usually too busy or preoccupied to really see them. Now that I know I won't be looking at them much longer, each time I see them feels like a miracle. The same mountains I took for granted for decades have become one of my greatest sources of joy." May began to understand. "You're saying that knowing about death makes life more meaningful?" "Not just knowing about death intellectually," Dr. Nobu clarified. "Everyone knows they will die someday. But really accepting that our time is limited, letting that truth change how we live, that's different. When you truly accept impermanence, not as a sad fact, but as the thing that makes each moment irreplaceable, everything changes." He returned to his painting, adding careful details to the flower's petals. "I am not happy because I'm dying, May. I'm happy because I'm finally truly living. For the first time in decades, I'm not postponing my life, waiting for some perfect moment to begin appreciating what I have. I'm here now, completely present for whatever time remains." Over the following weeks, May watched Dr. Nobu continue to embrace each day with remarkable presence and gratitude. He never seemed to waste a moment on regret or self-pity. Instead, he poured his full attention into whatever he was doing, whether it was having a conversation, eating a meal, or simply watching clouds move across the sky. When Dr. Nobu's condition worsened and he became bedridden, his approach remained the same. He would listen carefully to the sounds outside his window, appreciating birdsong and wind in the trees as if they were precious music. When visitors came, he would look into their eyes with complete attention, making each person feel truly seen and valued. On his final day, Dr. Nobu called May to his bedside. "I want to thank you for caring for me during these months," he said, his voice weak but clear. "And I want to share one last thing with you. What is that, doctor? Don't wait until you're dying to start really living. The knowledge that time is precious doesn't have to come from a terminal diagnosis. Every day is terminal, in the sense that each day that passes is gone forever. If you can remember this, not as a morbid thought, but as a reminder of how valuable each moment is, you will live more fully than most people ever do. Dr. Nobu died peacefully that evening. Those who had witnessed his final months said they had never seen anyone face death with such grace and aliveness. His example became a teaching for the entire village about how understanding impermanence can transform the way we experience life. This profound story shows us how accepting the reality of death can paradoxically make us more alive. Dr. Nobu's transformation illustrates one of Buddhism's most important insights. When we truly understand that our time is limited, we stop taking moments for granted and begin to experience life with much greater richness and presence. Notice that Dr. Nobu didn't suddenly become happy because he was dying. He became alive because he stopped living as if he had forever. The terminal diagnosis forced him to face what had always been true, but what he had been ignoring. Every day of his life had been precious and unrepeatable, but he had only begun appreciating this when time became obviously limited. Most of us live with what we might call immortality syndrome. We know intellectually that we won't live forever, but we behave as if we have unlimited time. We postpone important conversations, delay pursuing our dreams, rush through daily experiences while planning for some future when we'll finally slow down and appreciate what we have. But when we deeply accept impermanence, everything changes. Like Dr. Nobu savoring his breakfast or painting flowers with complete attention, we begin to approach each experience as if it might be our last. Not in a morbid way, but with an appreciation that comes from recognizing how precious and unrepeatable each moment truly is. The Buddhist teaching of impermanence is ultimately about learning to love life more completely by understanding its temporary nature. Dr. Nobu didn't need to die to learn this lesson. None of us do. We can choose to live with full awareness of impermanence right now. We can stop postponing our appreciation and begin treasuring each breath, each conversation, each moment of awareness. When we accept that everything changes and nothing lasts forever, we don't become sad or paralyzed. We become free. Free to be fully present. Free to love completely. Free to appreciate deeply. Free to live the life we have right now instead of the life we imagine we'll have someday. As you rest in this teaching now, feel how accepting impermanence creates both a tender awareness and a deeper appreciation for this moment. You don't need to wait for some crisis to begin treasuring your life. You can recognize right now that this breath is precious because you have a limited number of breaths. This moment is valuable because it will never come again. The wisdom of impermanence in Zen Buddhism is not meant to make us sad. It's meant to wake us up to the incredible gift of being alive right now. When we stop fighting against the natural flow of change and learn to appreciate each stage of life's unfolding, we find a peace and gratitude that no attempt to freeze time could ever provide. You have traveled far tonight through these ancient teachings. You have walked with masters and students, fishermen and gardeners, scholars and farmers. Each story has been a gift, offered freely, asking nothing in return except your presence. The wisdom you have encountered tonight is not something you need to memorize or hold tightly. These teachings will continue to work within you, gently reshaping how you meet each moment. Like seeds planted in fertile soil, they will grow in their own time, in their own way, without effort or forcing. You have learned about acceptance, about meeting reality as it is rather than as you wish it to be. You have discovered that compassion begins with yourself before extending to all beings. You have seen how presence transforms ordinary moments into something precious. You have understood that wisdom comes not from collecting knowledge, but from living truth directly. You have explored the freedom of non-attachment, the peace of holding life lightly while caring deeply. And you have touched the profound teaching of impermanence, understanding that the temporary nature of all things makes each moment irreplaceable. These are not lessons to study, but truths to live. They are not concepts to master, but realities to experience. As you rest now, let them settle into your body like gentle rain soaking into earth. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. Nothing to achieve or figure out. The path continues not through effort, but through simple awareness. Your peace will emerge naturally, like dawn arriving without announcement when you stop struggling and allow yourself to simply be. Rest deeply in this understanding. You are already whole. You are already home. You are already exactly where you need to be. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.